They clapped when they fired him. Not politely, not reluctantly. The entire security team actually clapped when Marcus Kane turned in his badge and walked out of the Sterling Global Gala into the cold Chicago night. A disgraced driver who'd made a scene, embarrassed the company, and wasted everyone's time with his paranoid warnings about threats nobody else could see. 47 minutes later, 4 armed men in tactical gear breached the hotel's east corridor, looking for the woman Marcus had just been protecting. The man they'd laughed out of the building was already waiting for them. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The black Lincoln Navigator smelled like leather conditioner and someone else's ambition. Marcus Kane had learned that about corporate cars in the first week. The smell wasn't accidental. Some detail-obsessed fleet manager had probably chosen that specific scent from a catalog, the same way everything at Sterling Global was chosen, deliberate, calculated, designed to project an image. Even the car that carried the CEO to meetings was a statement. Marcus just happened to be the one sitting in the front seat making sure it arrived on time. He didn't mind. Honestly, after 15 years in the Navy and 3 combat deployments across places most Americans couldn't find on a map, sitting behind a wheel in a climate-controlled vehicle felt almost embarrassing in its comfort. But comfort wasn't what had brought him here. A phone call had brought him here. A dying man's request. And Marcus Kane had never been good at saying no to the people he respected. He checked the rearview mirror out of habit. Not to look at Sophia Sterling, though she was back there, head bent over her tablet, reading something with the focused intensity she brought to everything. He checked it the same way he checked every mirror, every reflective surface, every sightline he passed, automatically, the way breathing was automatic. 6 months of driving her to meetings, airports, charity events, and corporate dinners, and the habit hadn't softened even slightly. If anything, it had sharpened. Because something was wrong. He couldn't say exactly when he'd first felt it. Somewhere around the 3rd week, maybe. A car that appeared in the same positions on different days. A pedestrian who looked too patient, standing too still near the Sterling Global parking structure 3 mornings in a row. Small things. Individual things. Things that meant nothing by themselves and everything together, once you knew how to read them. Marcus knew how to read them. His daughter Emma thought he was a driver. She was 9 years old and took enormous pride in telling her classmates that her dad drove a real CEO to work every day, which she considered significantly more impressive than most of her friends' fathers' jobs. Marcus had not corrected this impression. Emma didn't need to know about the other job. The real one. The one that had no official title, no business card, and paid nothing beyond the driver's salary that covered their apartment in Wicker Park, and Emma's school fees, and the small amount he set aside every month because single fathers didn't get the luxury of not thinking about the future. He pulled the Navigator to a smooth stop at the corner of Michigan Avenue and waited for the light. 3 cars back, a gray Chrysler 300 made a lane change that didn't make sense for anyone who actually needed to be in that lane. Marcus noted it, filed it, said nothing. In the back seat, Sophia didn't look up from her tablet. That was the thing about her that had surprised him most. He'd expected the stereotype, the entitled CEO who talked on her phone constantly, demanded specific bottled water, and treated the driver as furniture with a pulse. What he'd found instead was a woman who often rode in total silence, reading or thinking, who said please and thank you every single time, and who occasionally asked him genuine questions about traffic patterns in a way that suggested she was actually curious about his answer. She wasn't easy to read. She was focused and private and sometimes exhausting in her intensity, but she wasn't cruel. He respected that. He didn't tell her about the gray Chrysler, not yet. Not because he doubted himself, but because he'd been wrong before. Not about the threats, never about the threats, but about the timing. About when to surface information and when to keep watching. In the field, information released too early could compromise an entire operation. Marcus still thought in operational terms, probably always would. "You're taking Morrison instead of Wacker," Sophia said from the back seat. Not a question. "Construction delay on Lower Walker. Started this morning." He paused. "I checked the city permit database before pickup." A brief silence. Then, "You checked the city permit database. It updates overnight. Takes about 4 minutes." Another pause, longer this time. He could feel her deciding whether that was impressive or unsettling. Most people landed on unsettling. He was used to it. Okay, she said finally and went back to her tablet. The gray Chrysler turned off 2 blocks later. Marcus watched it go. Then he watched to see what replaced it. Oh. His name on paper was Marcus A. Kane. Enlisted at 19, a year out of high school in Rockford, Illinois, where he'd grown up in a house that was never quite loud enough and never quite warm enough in winter because his father believed that discomfort built character. A philosophy Marcus had come to regard as the convenient philosophy of a man who just didn't want to pay the heating bill. He'd been a serious kid. Quiet. The kind of quiet that teachers sometimes mistook for slowness until he handed in a test, and then they'd look at him differently, recalibrating, unsure what to make of him. The Navy had made something very specific out of him. Bud/S training had broken him twice before it didn't break him. He still carried the evidence of that in his left knee, which ached in cold weather, and in a small scar beneath his right ear that he'd long stopped noticing in mirrors. 3 deployments. Iraq once, Afghanistan twice. Things he didn't talk about because talking about them never made them smaller and sometimes made them bigger. So what was the point? He'd come home each time to a world that felt slightly out of phase with itself, like a television with the audio half a second behind the picture. He'd learned to live inside that gap. Most veterans did, one way or another. Elena had left when Emma was 4. Not cruelly, not with drama. She'd simply sat down across from him at their kitchen table one evening, set her coffee cup down carefully, and told him that she loved him, but she couldn't live with someone who was always watching the exits. He'd understood. He'd even agreed with her, which was maybe the saddest part of the whole conversation, that he could see himself clearly enough to understand why someone would leave and still be unable to change the thing that drove them away. He had Emma on full custody after that. Elena moved to Seattle and called every Sunday and loved Emma in the consistent, reliable way that people who've accepted their own limitations sometimes manage to love. Marcus didn't hold it against her. You couldn't hold it against someone for being honest about what they could carry. So it was him and Emma in the Wicker Park apartment, with its 2 thin walls and the neighbor who played guitar badly on Thursday nights, and the good natural light in the morning that Emma loved. He made her breakfast every day before school, scrambled eggs mostly, because that's what she requested, with a specific ratio of cheese to egg that she'd communicated to him in writing at age 7, presenting a hand-drawn chart as if making a formal proposal, which he supposed she was. He kept the chart on the refrigerator. Still there. The driving job at Sterling Global had come through a man named Walter Prentice, which was not a name Marcus had been given directly. He'd received a phone call from a lawyer, a careful, measured voice, identifying himself only as representing the interests of a party who wished to remain unnamed, offering him a position as a corporate driver at a salary that was frankly insulting for his skill set and experience, along with a separate arrangement that was considerably less insulting and paid in a manner that didn't appear on any conventional payroll. The separate arrangement was simple. Watch Sophia Sterling, protect her, report anything that seemed off, and do all of it without ever revealing to anyone, including Sophia herself, that he was anything more than a driver. The man who made this arrangement cared very much about her safety, the lawyer had said. He can no longer ensure it himself. He's asking you to do what he can no longer do. Who is he? Marcus had asked. A pause. Someone who served. Someone who knew your record. He'd taken the job. He told Emma he was going to be a driver for a while because he needed something steadier, and she'd accepted this without question because 9-year-olds generally accept what their parents tell them when the delivery is confident. He'd started the following Monday, put on the black suit that made him feel like he was attending a funeral for a previous version of himself, and shown up at Sterling Global's parking structure at 5:45 in the morning. That had been 6 months ago. In those 6 months, Marcus had learned the geography of Sophia Sterling's life with the same methodical completeness he'd once applied to learning foreign terrain. He knew which routes she preferred and which she didn't know she preferred. He knew that she worked better on Tuesdays than Mondays, that she drank her coffee too hot and always regretted it, that she had a habit of going very still when she was making an important decision, so still that it looked almost like she'd stopped breathing for a moment. He knew that she was harder on herself than anyone else in her company could ever be, and that she carried her father's death, 18 months ago, cancer, fast and brutal, like a stone she'd agreed to hold temporarily, and kept forgetting to put down. He also knew, with a certainty that had been building for weeks and was now impossible to dismiss, that someone inside Sterling Global was planning to remove her. Not fire her, not force her out through boardroom politics. Remove her. Physically. Long enough for something to happen to the company in her absence. Something that required her to be unreachable, silenced, unable to respond or testify, or block whatever transaction or vote or legal maneuver was waiting in the wings. He didn't know yet who. He had a list of candidates that had narrowed from 11 to 4. He was working on it. But the infrastructure of the operation was already visible to anyone who knew what visible infrastructure looked like, and Marcus had spent 15 years learning exactly that. The GPS tracker had been the first concrete piece. He'd found it during his 3rd week, tucked into the wheel well of the Navigator with the kind of care that suggested someone who knew what they were doing but hadn't counted on the driver also knowing what he was doing. Marcus had photographed it, documented its exact placement, and left it exactly where it was. You didn't remove surveillance equipment when you found it. You let it keep reporting, and you used it. He'd started varying routes by small degrees, never enough to trigger alarm, just enough to make the tracker's data slightly misleading. The travel routes had been next. Sophia's schedule was managed by her executive assistant, a competent and almost certainly innocent woman named Patricia. But the information flowed through a calendar system that Marcus had determined, after some careful observation of who accessed it and when, was being read by at least one person who shouldn't have been reading it. Someone was feeding her daily movements to an outside party. Not all of them, just specific ones. Key trips. Vulnerable windows. Then there was the surveillance itself. A man he'd started thinking of as Blue Coat, because the man owned apparently one coat and wore it every day, who positioned himself near Sterling Global's main entrance 3 or 4 mornings a week, always reading a newspaper, never actually turning a page. A second individual, heavy-set, who appeared in the parking structure on the days Sophia worked late. A third who he'd only caught twice, but who moved with the kind of professional awareness that made the back of Marcus's neck go tight, the way it used to go tight in Kandahar when something was about to happen and the street got too quiet. He'd tried to report it. That was the part that still sat badly with him 3 weeks later. Not with anger exactly. Anger was a luxury that professional training had mostly stripped away. But with a flat, cold understanding of how badly broken a system could become when the rot started at the top. He'd requested a meeting with Director Harlan Voss, the head of corporate security at Sterling Global. Voss was 61, silver-haired, impeccably suited, and possessed the confident bearing of a man who had never once been wrong, or at least had never once allowed himself to believe he had been. He ran the security department like a fiefdom, and his people were loyal to him in the way that people are loyal to someone who controls their careers. Marcus had sat across the desk from Voss and laid out what he had: the tracker, the surveillance patterns, the calendar access anomaly, calmly, methodically, the way he'd been trained to brief. Voss had listened, or performed listening, which Marcus recognized as a different thing. When Marcus finished, Voss had leaned back in his chair and looked at him the way certain men look at people they've already decided not to take seriously. "You're the driver," Voss said. "Yes." "And you're telling me you've identified a coordinated surveillance operation that my entire department missed." "I'm telling you what I observed." Voss had smiled at that. A thin smile, the kind that isn't really a smile at all. "Mr. Kane, I appreciate your vigilance, but corporate vehicles receive tracking devices from fleet vendors, parking contractors, insurance providers. It's standard. And the individuals you've described sound like," he glanced at his notes, "a newspaper reader, a man in a parking garage, and someone who walked by twice. You understand how that sounds?" "I understand how it sounds," Marcus said. "I'm telling you what it means." "I'll have someone look into the calendar system," Voss said, which was how people ended meetings they'd already decided not to act on. Marcus left the office. He'd known before walking in that there was roughly a 50% chance Voss was compromised, and a 50% chance he was simply a man who had confused self-confidence with competence. Both possibilities led to the same outcome: no action. So Marcus had kept watching, kept documenting, kept driving. He requested a second meeting 2 weeks later with a thicker folder. This time, Voss didn't even look at the documentation. He told Marcus that if he continued bringing unsubstantiated concerns to the security department, it would be noted in his personnel file. He said this pleasantly, the way unpleasant things are said when someone wants to avoid the appearance of saying an unpleasant thing. Marcus took the folder back and said, "Understood," because it was understood, just not in the way Voss meant it. He began preparing for the night he already knew was coming. The annual Sterling Global Gala was the most predictable high-value target window in the company calendar. Marcus had known it the moment the date appeared in Sophia's schedule. A massive event, hundreds of attendees, multiple entrances and exits, security attention divided and diluted. Sophia in one location, visible, accessible, surrounded by people who believed the formal security detail made her safe. It was the kind of situation that looked like protection and functioned like a gift-wrapped opportunity. He spent 3 weeks learning that hotel. Not as a guest, not as staff. He'd done that in the field, moved through spaces differently, invisibly. He walked the service corridors. He found the maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the east wing. He located 2 emergency exits that the hotel's own security team seemed to have stopped monitoring consistently, a fact he found both professionally alarming and personally useful. He timed how long it took to move from the ballroom to the parking structure via 3 different routes. He noted where the cameras were and where they weren't. He marked 2 rooms on the second floor that were consistently empty after 8 p.m. and whose windows accessed a fire escape that connected to a side alley rarely covered by any patrol route. He did all of this after his shifts, after Emma was asleep, driving back to the hotel in his own car and walking its corridors in ordinary clothes with the patient, invisible thoroughness of a man whose career had been built on knowing every room before the room became important. He told no one. Because there was no one left inside the building he was certain he could trust. And because the man who had hired him had been specific about that. Stay invisible. Don't surface until you have to. Don't reveal what you know until knowing it is the only thing that can protect her. The morning of the gala, Marcus made Emma her scrambled eggs with the correct cheese ratio and drove her to school and stood at the curb watching her backpack bounce as she ran toward the entrance and felt the particular heaviness that settles over a parent who knows the next several hours carry the possibility of things going very badly. He pushed it down. He'd pushed it down in worse places. He got back in his car and drove to Sterling Global. Sophia was in the back seat by 7:15. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and had her hair pulled back in a way that meant she had back-to-back meetings all morning and hadn't slept well. There were shadows under her eyes that her makeup had mostly but not entirely concealed, and she was holding her coffee cup with both hands and looking out the window with an expression he'd cataloged as the one she wore when she was worried about something she wasn't going to tell anyone she was worried about. "Big night," Marcus said. Not really a question, more an acknowledgement. She took a sip, made the expression she always made when she'd burned her mouth. 400 guests, 3 board members I'd rather not spend 3 hours making small talk with, and the Meridian deal announcement at 9, which means I'll spend the entire night watching Victor Langley try to take credit for a deal he spent 6 months opposing. She paused. So, yes, big night. The hotel has good sight lines from the main entrance, Marcus said, which was both true and not entirely why he was saying it. She looked at him then. A look that lasted slightly longer than her usual quick acknowledgments. Something in it he couldn't quite categorize. Not suspicion exactly, more like a question she was deciding whether to ask. She didn't ask it. "Thank you, Marcus," she said instead, and looked back out the window. He drove. He thought about the service tunnel that ran from the hotel's sub-basement to an access point 2 blocks east on Randolph Street. He thought about the fire escape off the second-floor window. He thought about the gray Chrysler he'd spotted twice this week. Different plates both times, but same slight dent in the rear passenger door. Same driver. Same deliberate patience. He thought about the phone call he'd made 48 hours ago to a number the lawyer had given him for emergencies, and the voice on the other end that had told him to be ready and to trust his judgment and to keep her alive. He thought about Emma's chart on the refrigerator, the hand-drawn cheese-to-egg ratio. He drove, and he watched, and he said nothing else. The day blurred past in the way that days before something happens always blur. Too much of everything unimportant, not enough of anything that mattered. Sophia moved through back-to-back meetings while Marcus sat in the Sterling Global parking structure and worked through his checklist for the 14th time. Not because he'd missed anything, because this was what you did. You checked again. And again. And when you were done checking, you checked once more, because the mission that killed people was always the one where someone decided they'd checked enough. He called Emma at 3:30 during her free period. She told him she'd gotten a 94 on her science test, and that her friend Jasmine said that was a bad grade, but Emma strongly disagreed and wanted his opinion. 94 is an excellent grade, Marcus said. That's what I said. Jasmine's wrong. I know. I just wanted you to say it too. A pause. Are you working tonight? Until late, yeah. Okay. Another pause, shorter. Be careful, Dad. She said it lightly, the way kids say things they mean seriously. He understood. Always, he said. Tell Mrs. Rodriguez I'll pick you up by 8. He hung up and sat in the car for a long moment with his hand still resting on the phone. Then he put it in his pocket, adjusted the collar of the black suit, and went to do his job. The gala began loading at 5 p.m. Marcus positioned the navigator in the hotel's private arrival bay and watched 400 people process through the main entrance over the next 90 minutes. He watched Voss's security team deploy around the perimeter, 12 personnel, competent looking, professionally arranged, covering exactly the positions that an outside observer would expect a professional security team to cover, which was the problem. Real threats didn't come from where a security team expected them. They came from the places no one thought to cover because everyone assumed someone else was covering them. He watched Blue Coat arrive at 6:47. Coat check this time, which was new. Moving inside. That told Marcus the timeline was narrowing. They were transitioning from surveillance to active phase, which meant the window for something happening tonight was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. He texted a number he'd memorized from the emergency call. 4 words. Tonight, east. Service entrance. No response came. That was fine. He hadn't expected one. At 8:15, things went wrong faster than even he'd prepared for. The radio on the security desk crackled with a report of a disturbance in the hotel's lower parking level. 2 vehicles, possible road rage, management requesting uniform presence. Marcus watched through the lobby glass as 2 of Voss's team pulled away from their positions to respond. Then, 4 minutes later, another call. A guest had reported a medical emergency on the 3rd floor. 2 more personnel redirected. Then a fire alarm in the kitchen. A small one, quickly resolved, but pulling security's attention inward and downward for the 4 critical minutes it took to confirm and clear. It was elegant. He'd give them that. They were pulling the security team apart like someone disassembling a watch. Each piece moved deliberately, methodically, each distraction calibrated to redirect without alarming. By 8:27, Voss had half his normal coverage on the ballroom floor, and the east corridor was effectively unmonitored. Marcus moved. He was already inside. He'd entered through the service entrance at 6 p.m. and had been ghosting the hotel's back corridors for 2 hours, checking his positions, confirming his routes. He moved now through the maintenance hallway behind the ballroom kitchen, past the industrial dishwashers and the stacked crates of glassware, toward the back stairwell that would take him to the corridor behind the east wing. He found Voss outside the ballroom at 8:31. The security chief was on his phone, talking quietly, body angled away from the room in a way that was either discretion or guilt, and Marcus watched his face for 2 seconds, the set of the jaw, the steadiness of the eyes, and made his decision. Guilt. Voss knew what was coming. Maybe hadn't built it. Maybe hadn't wanted it to go this far. But he knew. That made him useless and dangerous simultaneously. Marcus went around him. He was coming up the east corridor when he heard Sophia's voice, that particular tone she used when she was managing someone she'd grown tired of managing, near the private exit alcove off the ballroom. He rounded the corner and saw her. She was in her gown now, deep navy, and she was talking to her assistant Patricia while a man Marcus didn't recognize in a hotel uniform. Wrong posture, wrong hands, those weren't service hands, held open a door to what was being presented as a private vehicle arrival. Marcus assessed the scene in the time it took him to close the distance. The vehicle outside the door. Black SUV, engine running, tinted glass, no hotel branding on the door that should have had hotel branding. The man in the hotel uniform, standing too straight, weight distributed for action, earpiece visible if you knew where to look. Patricia, genuinely confused, checking her phone, frowning at a message she'd just received. The door was open. Sophia had taken 2 steps toward it. He came through the alcove at a pace that wasn't running but covered ground like running, and he put himself between Sophia and the door in one movement that brought him close enough to the man in the hotel uniform that he could have ended that problem right there. He didn't. Not yet. "Miss Sterling," Marcus said. His voice was level, completely level. He'd practiced that. Not the words, you couldn't practice words, but the register, the calm, the specific frequency that communicated that the situation required stopping without triggering panic in everyone around her. "I need you to step back inside." Sophia stared at him. "Marcus, what?" "Please," he said. Just that. Something in his face made her stop. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. The moment when you suddenly see something you didn't know you'd been looking at. She stepped back. The man in the hotel uniform moved. Marcus was ready for it, had been ready for it since he came around the corner. The man was trained, not at the level Marcus had been trained, but trained and committed and fast. He came in low and hard with the confidence of someone who expected to overwhelm a driver. Marcus sidestepped, controlled the momentum, used the man's own forward motion against him in a way that put him face first into the alcove wall before he'd completed his first thought. It was fast and brutal and quiet, which was the only way Marcus had ever learned to do it. The SUV outside revved, moving. From somewhere in the east corridor behind him, Marcus heard the sound of additional people coming, moving fast, not trying to be quiet about it anymore, which meant the operation had shifted to direct action, which meant they were past the point of subtlety, which meant every second now was the kind of second you didn't get back. He turned to Sophia. She was staring at the man on the floor with an expression he didn't have time to read. "I need you to do exactly what I say," Marcus said. "Right now." She looked at him. "Who are you?" It was, he thought, exactly the right question, and the worst possible time to be asked it. "Someone your father trusted," he said. "That's going to have to be enough for the next 10 minutes. She held his gaze for 1 second. 2. Somewhere behind them, the sound of running feet hit the hallway floor. "Okay," Sophia Sterling said. And they ran. The maintenance corridor was narrow and lit with the kind of functional fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Marcus took her through it at a pace she matched without complaint. She had the sense not to ask questions while moving, which he appreciated more than he could have said. He took 3 turns, bypassed a junction that would have taken them toward the loading dock and into exactly the kind of open space he didn't want, and brought them through a metal door marked Utility Access, authorized personnel only, that opened with a keycard he'd duplicated during his reconnaissance visits. Behind them, the hotel was coming apart in controlled chaos. He could hear it even through the walls, raised voices, radio calls, the specific quality of sound that a large secure space makes when it stops being secure. "There are people after us," Sophia said, stating it, not asking. Her voice was even. That surprised him. "Yes." "From the company?" He glanced at her as they moved. "Some of them." She was quiet for 3 steps. Then, "Voss?" He didn't answer, which was an answer. She made a sound that wasn't quite a word, something that carried 6 months of misplaced trust in it, compressed into a single exhaled breath. Then she squared her shoulders and kept running. The service tunnel was exactly where he'd mapped it. Cold, concrete, smelling of standing water and old machinery, lit by bare bulbs strung along one wall. Marcus moved through it with the certainty of someone who had walked it in his mind 100 times before walking it in his body. Sophia stayed half a step behind him, close but not crowding him, adapting her pace to his without being told to. At the end of the tunnel, a metal ladder led up to a maintenance grate on a sidewalk 2 blocks east of the hotel. Marcus went up first, checked the alley above. Clear, a food truck closing up for the night half a block away, a couple walking their dog in the opposite direction, and reached down for her hand. She took it. They came up out of the ground 2 blocks from the hotel where 400 people were still eating canapes and making small talk, unaware that the company's future had just nearly been stolen from under them in a side corridor. Marcus had a car parked on Randolph, a plain gray Civic he'd registered under a name that wasn't his own 3 weeks ago, using a process the lawyer had helped him arrange. He'd told himself at the time it was excessive preparation. Standing next to Sophia Sterling on a dark sidewalk in Chicago, with the sound of distant sirens starting to filter through the city noise, he had revised that assessment. She got in the passenger seat without being asked. He started the car. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Somewhere safe," he said. "I need to show you some things." "What kind of things?" He pulled out of the parking spot, checked his mirrors, clean, clear, no headlights that looked deliberate, and merged onto Randolph heading west. "Everything," he said. Sophia Sterling looked out the window at the city going past, and he watched her reflection in the glass. The set of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes even now, the grief that she kept always slightly below the surface since her father died. He thought about what he was about to tell her, about her father, about the last request a dying man had made to a former soldier who'd never learned to leave anyone behind. He thought about Emma's chart on the refrigerator. He drove west through Chicago at 9 p.m., through the lit corridors of a city that had no idea what had just happened inside that hotel, carrying a woman who was about to learn that the person she'd most underestimated had been the only one, from the very beginning, who was actually on her side. The gray Civic's heater kicked on. The city lights slid past the windows. Marcus Kane drove, and he said nothing more, and he let the silence hold everything that words couldn't carry yet. The safe house wasn't a house. It was a second-floor apartment above a dry-cleaning shop on West Fulton Market that smelled like solvent and old radiator heat, and the lock on the front door required 2 keys in a specific sequence that Marcus had practiced until his hands could do it in the dark. Which, tonight, they did. Because the stairwell light had burned out sometime in the last 48 hours, and he hadn't anticipated needing to replace it. A small failure of preparation that annoyed him more than it should have given everything else happening simultaneously. Sophia said nothing while he worked the lock. She stood 1 step behind him on the landing, with her arms crossed over her chest. Not frightened, he was fairly certain, more like someone containing a very large number of things she intended to say as soon as there was a door between them and the rest of the world. The lock gave. He pushed the door open and let her go first. She stepped inside and stopped in the middle of the small living room, taking it in. There wasn't much to take in. A couch that had lived a previous life somewhere more comfortable. A folding table against the far wall that held a laptop, a printer, and 3 stacked manila folders. A corkboard mounted to the wall above it, covered in photographs, printed documents, and handwritten notes connected by lengths of red string in the particular pattern that looks insane from a distance and inevitable up close. A window with the blinds drawn. A lamp with a 40-watt bulb that gave the room the amber quality of late evening, regardless of what time it actually was. Sophia looked at the corkboard for a long moment. "How long?" she said. 6 months?" She turned to look at him then, and he saw her doing the math. 6 months ago was when he'd started driving for her, and the calculation behind her eyes was the recognition of what that meant, that every morning she'd handed him her coffee order and said good morning and made small talk about traffic. He had been looking at this, carrying this. "Sit down," he said. "I'll explain everything." "I'll stand," she said. He'd expected that. He pulled out the first folder. He talked for 40 minutes. He laid it out the way he'd been trained to brief. Not chronological, which felt natural but buried the important things under context, but by significance, starting with what mattered most and working outward to the structure that supported it. He showed her the tracker. The photographs of Blue Coat in his rotation of identical positions. The printed calendar access logs he'd pulled from a copy of the server data he wasn't supposed to have access to and had anyway, through a contact whose name he didn't provide and whose methods he didn't explain. The shell company documentation. The financial trail that led from 3 specific accounts held under subsidiary names to a holding company registered in Delaware with no visible operational purpose other than to receive money and redirect it in smaller increments to places that were harder to follow. Sophia took each document when he offered it and read it properly, which he hadn't been entirely sure she'd do. Some people, when presented with evidence of something they don't want to believe, skim it and hand it back, which is a way of engaging without engaging. She read it all the way through, set it on the table with her right hand flat on top of it, like she was pressing it into reality. "Victor Langley," she said. His name came out flat, like something she'd bitten down on. "He's the center of it," Marcus said, "but he's not alone. There are 2 board members involved, Reeves and Park, and at least one person in legal who's been reviewing the Meridian deal documents in ways that don't match their assigned role." "Reeves and Park," she repeated. Something moved across her face. "I had drinks with Claire Park 3 weeks ago. She told me she was worried about the company's direction, that she thought I was moving too fast with the expansion." She put the document down. "I thought she was being honest with me." "She was giving you cover," Marcus said, creating a narrative that she'd expressed concerns internally, so when the board moved against you, it would look like a principled disagreement instead of what it actually is. Sophia was quiet for a moment. In the amber light of the apartment, with her gown incongruously formal against the bare walls, she looked simultaneously more and less like the person he'd been watching for 6 months, less like the CEO, more like someone who was 48 hours from a decision that couldn't be unmade. "They were going to take me," she said. It wasn't a question anymore. "Tonight. Long enough for an emergency board session to convene," Marcus said. "You'd be unreachable, possibly abroad. They'd manufacture travel records. The board would vote on emergency executive succession under the company charter's crisis clause, which Langley has been quietly amending through legal for the past 4 months. By the time you resurface, the vote would be final, and contested succession proceedings would take 2 years minimum." He paused. "They didn't need you gone permanently. They just needed you gone long enough." Sophia put both hands flat on the table and looked down at the surface between them. Her hair had come partly loose in the running and the tunnel, and she hadn't fixed it, and there was a small tear at the hem of her gown from the maintenance corridor that she either hadn't noticed or had decided not to think about. She was 30 years old and her company was being stolen from inside, and the man she'd trusted to protect her had been the architect of the theft. "Voss knew," she said. "I don't think he built it," Marcus said, "because fairness mattered, even here. But yes, he knew. They needed someone inside security to manage the coverage gaps tonight. The medical emergency, the parking dispute, the kitchen alarm. Those were all his. His personnel. His authorizations. I promoted him." The words came out very quiet. 18 months ago, after my father died, the first major decision I made was promoting Harlan Voss to director, because he'd been there for 12 years and my father trusted him, and I thought continuity meant stability. She stopped, started again. I thought experience meant trustworthy. Marcus didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to someone figuring out a painful truth was silence. She stayed that way for almost a full minute, looking at the table. Then she straightened, rolled her shoulders back, looked at him directly. "Who are you?" she said. "Actually," he told her. "Not everything. There were parts of his service record that weren't his to share, and parts of the private arrangement he'd been hired under that required the lawyer's disclosure, not his. But the essentials: his name, his background, his years of service, his life in the Wicker Park apartment with Emma and the badly playing guitar neighbor, and the chart on the refrigerator. He told her about the phone call from the lawyer and the offer he'd accepted and what he'd been asked to do and why. She listened. Her expression shifted through several things he couldn't fully name. Surprise, which was expected. Something more complicated, which wasn't. "The lawyer," she said when he finished. "Representing a party who wished to remain unnamed." "Yes." "Was it my father?" The question was in the room before he'd finished deciding how to answer it. He looked at her. The set of her jaw, the controlled evenness she was maintaining over something that was clearly costing her, and made a call. "I don't know for certain," he said. "I was never given a name, but the timing, the knowledge of your father's concerns about the company, the specific instruction to keep you safe from inside." He stopped. "I think you probably already know the answer." She pressed her lips together for a moment, nodded once, looked away. James Sterling had built the company from a regional logistics firm into a global operation over 30 years, through a combination of intelligence and stubbornness and the specific kind of loyalty to his employees that made people work for someone not just because of compensation, but because of genuine belief. He'd been sick for 8 months before he died. And in those 8 months, Marcus had now come to understand he'd been watching his own house and finding things he couldn't fix from a hospital bed, so he'd found someone else to fix them. Sophia put a hand over her eyes for a moment, just a moment. Then she took it away and looked back at Marcus with the careful evenness of someone who had decided this particular grief belonged to a different hour. "Okay," she said. "What do we do now?" He'd been waiting for that question. Not impatiently. He understood she'd needed to move through everything that came before it, but with the readiness of someone who'd had the answer prepared for weeks. "We go back," he said. She stared at him. "Back where?" "The company. The board meeting they're going to call." He looked at her steadily. "You're not missing. You're not abroad. You're not incapacitated. The entire operation tonight depended on them having you. They don't have you, which means the window they built is closing right now, and when it closes, they have a choice. They abort everything, which means the evidence trail goes cold, and they walk away clean. Or they panic. Panicking people make mistakes." He paused. "We need them to panic." Sophia looked at him for a long moment. "You want to walk back into that building. Not the hotel, the company headquarters, tomorrow morning before they've had time to regroup." He picked up the second folder. "I have recorded conversations, not clean ones. They were obtained in ways that wouldn't survive a courtroom on their own. But combined with the financial records and the access logs and the physical evidence from tonight, including the man in the fake hotel uniform, who is currently being handled by people I contacted 2 days ago." "What people?" "People from outside the company," he said. "I called them on Wednesday. They've been waiting." He didn't explain further, and she didn't push. "The point is, we have enough. We have enough to put it in front of the right people in the right sequence and end this. But it has to happen fast. Before they get lawyers assembled and stories coordinated and gaps in the evidence filled with plausible alternatives." Sophia was looking at the corkboard. All those threads, all those photographs. 6 months of invisible work she'd been driving past every morning without knowing it existed. "You've been doing this alone," she said. Not accusatory, more like she was reading a fact off a page. "Yes." "The whole time?" "Yes." She was quiet for a beat. "Did you ever think about just—" She stopped, started again. "There must have been a point where it would have been easier to quit. Take Emma and just—" "No," he said, simply, no elaboration. She looked at him. He didn't look away. "No," she said finally. "I guess there wasn't." Outside, somewhere below, a car went past slowly. Marcus tracked it by sound without moving, speed, direction, whether it stopped. It didn't stop. He exhaled a breath he hadn't been aware of holding. "You should try to sleep," he said. "There's a back room. It's not comfortable." "I'm not going to sleep." "I know, but sit down at least." He moved toward the window and adjusted the blinds a quarter inch to check the street. Empty. The dry cleaner's sign was off. Fulton Market at this hour was quiet, in the way that parts of Chicago were only quiet after the restaurants closed. "We have a few hours. I need to make some calls." She didn't argue. She crossed to the couch and sat down and pulled her knees up in a posture that was completely at odds with the formal gown, and that made her look suddenly younger, more like the person she might have been before 30 years of her father's legacy settled on her shoulders. "Marcus," she said. He looked at her. "The man in the corridor. The one who came at us." She held his gaze. "You could have—" "He'll be fine," Marcus said. "Headache, maybe a concussion. He'll be questioned before morning." She nodded. Something worked behind her eyes. "You've been protecting me for 6 months, and I didn't know you were doing it. I thought you were a driver," he said. "I was going to say, I thought you were quiet because you were reserved, not because you were—" She gestured at the corkboard. "All of it." "I am reserved," Marcus said. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the ghost of one, and under the circumstances he counted it. He took out his phone and moved toward the back of the apartment where the signal was better and the window faced an alley rather than the street. He had 4 calls to make. The first 2 were short, check-ins, confirmations, the brief coded language of people who've prepared a contingency and are now activating it. The third call was to a federal contact whose name he'd been given in an envelope, along with a phone number, and the instruction to use it only when the evidence was solid enough to be worth the call. Marcus had decided 2 days ago that it was solid enough. He'd been waiting for tonight to confirm it. The fourth call was to Mrs. Rodriguez, Emma's overnight sitter, to let her know he'd be later than expected and to please make sure Emma ate breakfast before school, and not just cereal, actual breakfast, because Emma would negotiate down to cereal if given any opening at all. "She's fine," Mrs. Rodriguez said. "Asleep already. She said to tell you she got a 94. "I know," Marcus said. "Tell her I'm proud of her." He hung up and stood in the dark back room for a moment with the phone in his hand, listening to the sounds of the apartment. Sophia on the other side of the wall, the occasional car outside, the building's old heating system working at something in its pipes. Normal sounds. Ordinary sounds. The kind of sounds that existed on the far side of every operation he'd ever run. The world continuing at its normal pace while the thing that needed doing got done. He went back out. Sophia had taken off her shoes and was sitting cross-legged on the couch with the third folder open on her knees, reading by the lamp's amber light. She looked up when he came back in. "The Delaware Holding Company," she said. "The account number's at the bottom of page 4. Those matched transfers I was shown last month as part of a vendor restructuring proposal. I signed off on the restructuring." He sat down in the chair across from her. "I know." "You knew I'd signed off on it." "Yes. And you didn't tell me." "I didn't have proof yet of where the money was actually going. I needed the full chain before I said anything." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate." She looked at him for a moment, then back at the folder. "You're right that it's inadequate," she said quietly. "Also, I understand why you did it." She turned a page. "Those 2 things can both be true at once." He hadn't expected that. Most people in his experience, when given an opening to be angry, took it, because anger was easier than the complicated alternative. Sophia Sterling apparently operated in the complicated alternative. "The financial records," she said. "How did you get these?" "Sources," he said. "Illegal sources?" "Some of them." She looked up, a direct look, no softening around it. "Will that be a problem?" "In court, potentially. In the board meeting, no. The board can act on information regardless of how it was obtained. Only a criminal prosecution requires clean sourcing, and by the time this gets to criminal proceedings, the investigators will have their own chain." He paused. "I've been careful about what goes where. What we use tomorrow is admissible. What I hand to the federal contact tonight gets used differently." She absorbed this. He watched her processing it the way she processed everything, fully, without flinching. "You've thought about this in layers," she said. "Force of habit." "Where did you serve?" The question came sideways, without announcement, the way genuine questions usually do. He looked at her. "Iraq, Afghanistan, 2 tours. When did you get out?" 4 years ago." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer was personal in a way that very few things still were. "My wife left. Emma needed a parent who came home." He paused. "That's the short version." Sophia looked at him with an expression he couldn't categorize exactly, something that was partly recognition and partly the particular care that someone extends when they've touched an edge they didn't mean to touch. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be. It was the right call." He shifted in the chair. "Emma's the smartest person I know. She made a chart at age 7 about cheese ratios." Sophia blinked. "Cheese ratios?" "Egg-to-cheese ratio. For scrambled eggs, specific percentages, presented it formally. I still have it on the refrigerator." He said it without expression, which was the only way to say things that mattered without making them sound like they mattered too much. Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Then, quietly, genuinely, "She sounds remarkable." "She is," he said. They sat in the amber light for a while after that, not talking. Outside, Chicago moved through its nighttime rhythms, and somewhere across town, the Sterling Global Gala was probably winding down. The caterers clearing tables, the guests departing with their gift bags and their small talk still warm in their mouths, none of them knowing that the event had been 2 corridors away from something that couldn't have been undone. Harlan Voss was somewhere in that hotel, or on his way out of it, recalibrating. Victor Langley was somewhere making phone calls, adjusting, trying to understand why his vehicle had arrived at the east exit and left empty. Marcus thought about the moment Langley figured out the operation had failed, the anger that would follow, then the calculation, then the fear, which was the most dangerous part. Not the anger, never the anger, but the fear, because fear made people do things that weren't in anyone's original plan. He needed to move before the fear became action. Try to rest, he said again. 2 hours, even just lying down. You're not going to rest. No. So why should I? Because tomorrow requires you sharp and I can operate on less sleep than you're currently imagining. She looked like she wanted to argue that. Instead, she pulled a throw blanket from the arm of the couch. He'd put it there 2 weeks ago during a prep visit, and she didn't know that. Didn't know how many small things in this room were there because of her. And lay down without ceremony, still in the formal gown, shoes still off, the folder set aside but within reach. Marcus, she said to the ceiling. Yeah. What would have happened if you hadn't been there tonight? He considered giving her the sanitized version. He didn't. The vehicle they had waiting was going to take you to a private airfield in Gary. From there, destination unclear but likely somewhere without a favorable extradition relationship with the U.S. You'd have been held until the board vote finalized. After that, he stopped. The people behind this needed you gone, not gone forever. Probably. But the people they hired to make it happen, he stopped again. The ceiling seemed to hold her attention for a moment. Probably, she repeated. Yes. Okay, she said, and nothing more. He turned the lamp off and sat in the dark with his eyes adjusted to the ambient light coming through the blind's edges, and he watched the door and the window and the patterns of light and shadow on the wall that told him things about what was happening outside, and he let her have the quiet. He didn't sleep. He hadn't expected to. Around 2 a.m, the radiator knocked loudly enough to startle anyone who wasn't already awake. Marcus looked toward the couch. Sophia's breathing had slowed and steadied an hour ago. She was asleep, which he was grateful for, and she was still in the formal gown with the throw blanket pulled up to her shoulders, and there was a quality to the sight that made him think about what it meant to carry something too large for too long and finally set it down for even a couple of hours. He turned back to the window, made his 5th call of the night, confirmed the morning timeline, verified that the man from the hotel corridor was in custody and talking, which the contact said he was, reluctantly and incompletely, but talking, which was enough, confirmed that the financial transfer records had been received and were being reviewed. He hung up and sat in the dark and thought about his daughter. He thought about the way Emma had said, "Be careful," Dad on the phone today with that particular lightness that covered something heavier. The way she understood, at 9, that there were things about her father's job that she wasn't supposed to ask about directly, and had developed instead this sideways vocabulary for worry. The careful emphasis, the extra pause, the okay that meant, "I trust you, but please come back." He would come back. He intended to come back. He'd run enough operations to know that intention and outcome weren't the same thing, but he also knew that the odds tonight had shifted significantly in the right direction, and that by this time tomorrow either this was over or it had gotten complicated in ways he couldn't yet predict. And either way, Emma would have her father at the breakfast table making eggs with the correct cheese ratio. At 4:30 a.m., he woke Sophia with a hand on her shoulder and a cup of terrible instant coffee that was all he had in the apartment. She came awake quickly, not startled, just present, as if she'd been sleeping lightly enough that consciousness was just one step away. She sat up, took the coffee, and looked at him with clear eyes that said she was already past the sleep and into whatever came next. "Time?" she said. 4:30. She drank the coffee, made no comment about its quality. "What do we do first?" "First, I need to make you look less like you just ran through a maintenance tunnel in a gown." He'd thought of this too. There was a bag in the back room that held clothes in her approximate size. Conservative, appropriate for a business meeting, the kind of thing that said executive, not escapee. He'd bought them 3 weeks ago during one of the prep visits, standing in a department store feeling like an idiot and doing it anyway because an idiot with a contingency plan was better than a competent person without one. And then I'm going to explain exactly how we walk back into that building. Every step, every word you say, and when you say it. Sophia lowered the coffee cup, looked at him steadily. And if it goes wrong? I have contingencies. Of course you do. She stood up, straightened her back, pushed her hair out of her face. The gown was wrinkled, and the small tear at the hem was still there, and none of that touched her bearing at all, which he'd observed before but found himself noting again. She was not an easy person to knock down. Show me the clothes. He brought the bag. She disappeared into the back room. He heard the quiet sounds of someone changing, and he turned back to the corkboard and reviewed the pieces one final time, the same way he'd reviewed every mission brief in the 20 minutes before it went live. Not looking for new information, but confirming the existing architecture, making sure every connection held, every sequence was right, every contingency was where he'd put it. When she came back out, she was wearing dark slacks and a charcoal blouse, and her hair was pulled back with an elastic she'd found somewhere. She looked like the CEO. She looked like someone who had decided not to be rattled by the night she'd just had, which wasn't the same as not being rattled, but which was, Marcus had always believed, the more meaningful choice. She looked at the corkboard one last time. All those threads. 6 months of her life laid out in red string and photographs. He really did send you, she said quietly. Not asking, just holding the fact. Marcus didn't answer. He picked up the folders, closed the laptop, and looked at her. You ready? Sophia Sterling straightened the collar of the borrowed blouse, picked up her shoes from beside the couch, looked at him with something in her eyes that wasn't quite certainty and wasn't quite fear, and was maybe the space between them where real decisions lived. Yeah, she said. Let's go take my company back. The lock on the apartment door required the same sequence on the way out as it did on the way in. Marcus worked it in the dark. Behind him, Sophia waited without impatience. Below, on West Fulton Market, the city was beginning its 4:30 shift. Delivery trucks, early kitchen staff, the particular blue quality of Chicago pre-dawn that belonged to neither night nor morning, but to the thin hour between them. They went down the stairs together, two people with a folder of evidence and a plan, and no real guarantee that any of it would hold. Stepping out into the cold air of a city that had no idea what was about to happen inside one of its largest corporations. Marcus checked the street. Clear. He nodded. They moved. The drive to Sterling Global Headquarters took 19 minutes at that hour, through streets that belonged to delivery drivers and hospital workers, and the particular category of person who chooses the 4:30 shift because the world is quieter then, and quiet has its own value. Marcus took a route that added 4 minutes to the trip, but kept them off the two main corridors he'd identified as most likely to have eyes on them. Not paranoia, just math. The operation last night had failed, which meant whoever was running it was now in damage control mode, which meant resources that had been allocated to the original plan were being redirected, and redirected resources meant unpredictable coverage patterns. Unpredictable was the thing he liked least. Sophia sat in the passenger seat of the gray Civic with a paper cup of gas station coffee. They'd stopped 2 blocks from the apartment because the instant coffee had been genuinely terrible, and she hadn't complained, but he'd noticed. And she was looking out the window at Chicago going past with an expression he'd come to recognize over 6 months as her thinking face. Not blank, active, like something was running behind her eyes that hadn't reached her mouth yet. My father had a phrase, she said, without preamble, the way people say things they've been holding for a while. He used to say that the most dangerous person in any room was the one nobody was watching. She paused. I thought he meant it as a business strategy. Pay attention to the quiet competitors, the ones who aren't making noise yet. Marcus said nothing. Sometimes the right thing was to let a thought finish itself. I didn't think he meant it literally. She looked down at the coffee cup. I didn't think he meant watch the driver. He didn't tell me everything, Marcus said. The lawyer gave me an assignment and a salary and a phone number for emergencies. That was it. He changed lanes, checked the mirror, settled back. But the assignment was specific enough that whoever designed it understood exactly what the threat looked like. Which means your father had been watching this develop for a while before he stopped. Before he ran out of time to do anything about it himself, Sophia finished. She said it without visible emotion, which was the kind of thing people did when they'd already done the emotional part somewhere private, and what remained was just the fact. Yes, Marcus said. She was quiet for half a block. Then, did the lawyer tell you anything about what my father suspected, specifically? He said your father believed there were people inside the company who were planning to use the transition period, after his death, before you were fully established, to make a move on the company's assets. He said your father had identified at least one board member as compromised but didn't have clean proof. He said, Marcus paused, choosing the next part carefully. He said your father was most worried that you'd trust the wrong people because you'd been raised to believe that longevity equaled loyalty. The sentence landed. He felt it land, even without looking at her. Longevity equaled loyalty, she repeated quietly. His words, according to the lawyer. She absorbed that for a moment. Outside, the city's skyline was beginning to define itself against the pre-dawn sky. The buildings going from black shapes to lit windows, the particular quality of Chicago at 5 a.m. when the night shift and the morning shift briefly occupy the same world. He was right, she said. That's exactly what I believed. Harlan Voss had been with the company for 12 years. Victor Langley joined the board 8 years ago. Claire Park, 6. I thought... She stopped. Started again. I thought people who'd been there through the hard years had earned their place, that they had skin in it. They did have skin in it, Marcus said, just not the skin you thought. She made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the sound of someone acknowledging a painful irony without finding it particularly funny. My father tried to warn me, she said. Not directly. He didn't do things directly if he could find another way. He'd say things like, watch how people behave when they think nothing's at stake. Watch what they protect. She looked out the window. I thought he was just being philosophical. He was sick, and he was trying to pass things on, and I thought he was being poetic. He was being practical, Marcus said. Yeah, she said. He was. They drove in silence for another few minutes. The Sterling Global building appeared ahead, a 40-story glass tower on West Adams that caught the first pale suggestions of morning light on its eastern face. The company logo at the top still lit in the dark blue and silver that James Sterling had chosen personally 30 years ago, and that no rebrand initiative had ever successfully argued against. It was a good building, solid, the kind that looked like it had been built to last. Marcus pulled into a parking structure 2 blocks away and killed the engine. He sat for a moment, going over the sequence one final time in his head. Not because he was uncertain, because this was the moment before, and the moment before was always when you either held your plan or you didn't. Walk me through it again, Sophia said. He turned to look at her. She was watching him with that particular steadiness, the one she deployed when she was managing her own nerves by focusing outward. He'd seen it in the alcove last night, and in the safe house, and now here, and each time he saw it, he revised upward his estimate of what she was made of. We go in through the service entrance on Adams, he said. My access card still works. They'll have flagged my badge by now, but the service entrance runs on a separate system that Voss's team doesn't manage directly. Building operations does, which means it updates on a 12-hour cycle, and the revocation hasn't processed yet. He'd confirmed this 40 minutes ago with a contact who had access to the building management system. We have a window, maybe 2 hours, maybe less. And if the window's already closed, I have a secondary. He didn't elaborate. She'd learned, over the course of the night, not to push on the secondaries. They existed and they were covered, and that was what mattered. Okay, she said. Then what? Then we go to the executive floor. Conference room B, not the boardroom. Boardroom has a glass wall facing the assistant pool, which gives us less control over who sees us before we're ready to be seen. Conference B is internal. One entrance. Controllable. He'd used this room twice in 6 months, when delivering documents that needed Sophia's signature and the main assistant station was crowded. He knew its dimensions, its angles, its single vulnerability, which was the ventilation panel on the north wall that amplified sound from the adjacent corridor, which he intended to use rather than worry about. I've already sent documents to the secure printer on that floor under a guest access code. They'll be waiting. Documents. Everything we need for the board presentation, the financial records, the access logs, the recorded conversations, formatted for a boardroom audience, not a legal team, clear, sequential, hard to argue with the structure of even if you wanted to argue with the content. He paused. I've been putting that together for 3 weeks. Sophia looked at him. 3 weeks ago, you were preparing a board presentation. I was preparing for every version of how this could go. Some of those versions were worse than last night. She didn't ask what the worst versions looked like. Smart. And the board members themselves, Reeves and Park, are compromised. That leaves 5 voting members plus you. Correct. Of those 5, I believe 3 are clean: Okafor, Hendricks, and Morrison. The other 2, Whitfield and Chen, I don't have evidence of direct involvement, but their behavior in recent board sessions has been, he considered his word choice, passive in ways that look like they might be waiting to see which way the wind blows. Whitfield and Chen will follow the evidence if it's presented clearly, Sophia said immediately. He could hear in her voice that she knew these people, had sat across tables from them, understood their particular calculus. They're not ideologues. They're risk-averse. If the evidence is strong enough that backing Langley looks more dangerous than supporting me, they'll move. That's what I assessed, Marcus said, which is why the presentation sequence matters. She was nodding slowly. You lead with the financial evidence because that's the cleanest. Numbers don't have allegiances. Then the access logs, which put specific people in contact with specific information at specific times. Then the recordings. Yes, and then the physical evidence from last night. The tracker, the hotel operation, the man in the uniform who is currently in federal custody and has agreed to provide a statement in exchange for cooperation consideration. Sophia went still. Federal custody. The contact I called Wednesday night was with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I sent them a preliminary evidence package 48 hours ago. They've been sitting on it, waiting for a triggering event significant enough to justify moving. He met her eyes. Last night was the triggering event. She was quiet for a moment, processing. He watched her land on the things she was going to ask. Did you know last night was going to happen? I knew it was likely. The gala was the obvious window and the operation was in active phase. I didn't know for certain. But you'd already called the FBI. Yes. Because you were preparing for the version where it happened. Yes. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Not angry. He'd braced for anger and found instead something more complicated. You've been running a parallel operation this whole time, she said. You've been protecting me and building a case simultaneously and keeping them separate so neither one compromised the other. That's a generous way to describe it, he said. The less generous way is that I've been making judgment calls with incomplete information for 6 months and hoping I got the sequence right. Did you? He looked at her. We're here, he said. The sequence is right. She looked out the windshield at the parking structure's gray concrete wall and the faint light coming from the Adams Street entrance. Then she looked back at him. My father picked well, she said quietly. Marcus didn't know what to do with that, so he did what he always did when he didn't know what to do with something. He moved. Let's go, he said. The service entrance on Adams was a heavy steel door set into the building's side, marked with a small placard that said, Authorized access only in the particular font that meant business without being aggressive about it. Marcus swiped his badge. The reader blinked green. He felt Sophia exhale behind him. They went in. The service corridor smelled like cleaning products and the kind of recycled air that never quite becomes fresh. It ran parallel to the building's main lobby and connected to a freight elevator that opened on every floor but was primarily used for building operations. Marcus had ridden it 6 times in his pre-op. He knew which floor it hesitated on, 17, for reasons he'd never identified. And he knew its speed and its noise and the fact that the interior camera had had a malfunctioning angle for at least the past month, which he'd reported to building management in his capacity as a driver with a concern and which had not yet been fixed. They rode up in silence. Sophia had her shoes on now. She'd put them on in the car, the formal gown night heels, because the borrowed flats he'd included in the prep bag were half a size too large, and she'd determined that heels were preferable to footwear that might cause her to trip at an operationally significant moment, which was a calculation Marcus respected. The elevator made its customary hesitation at 17. Neither of them commented on it. 32. The executive floor. The floor was not empty. Marcus had anticipated the possibility of early arrivals. Some of Langley's people might have been recalled after last night's failure. But the specific shape of what he found when the elevator doors opened was something he had to process quickly and in sequence. Patricia, Sophia's assistant, was at her desk at 5:20 a.m., which was 2 hours before her normal arrival, and which meant she'd been called in, which meant someone had been managing the cover story for the CEO's disappearance and needed the assistant to be present for optics or information. A man Marcus didn't recognize was standing near the entrance to Langley's office suite, the particular stillness of someone posted rather than waiting. And in the glass-walled boardroom, not Conference B, the actual boardroom, 3 figures were visible through the glass, in the middle of what appeared to be an intense conversation, and one of them was Victor Langley. Marcus put his hand on Sophia's arm. She stopped. He assessed quickly. Patricia had looked up from her desk at the elevator sound and was now staring at them with an expression that passed through surprise, relief, confusion, and something that looked like it might be guilt, all in the space of about 2 seconds. The man near Langley's office had noticed them and was reaching for something. A phone, not a weapon, but reaching with the speed of someone who has a number to call if something happens that wasn't supposed to happen. Marcus made 3 decisions in under a second. He crossed to the man near Langley's office, covered the distance before the phone was fully out, and put his hand over the man's in a way that wasn't violent but was absolutely unambiguous. "Don't," he said quietly. The man looked at him, looked at his hand, made the correct decision. "Patricia," Sophia said, and her voice came out so completely steady that Marcus, in his peripheral vision, was briefly impressed. "I need you to call security, not Voss's team, building security, the overnight supervisor. And I need you to call Okafor, Hendricks, and Morrison and tell them there's an emergency board session requested by the CEO in Conference B in 20 minutes. Don't call anyone else. Do you understand?" Patricia stared at her. "Miss Sterling, There's been... Mr. Langley said that you..." "I know what Mr. Langley said," Sophia said. "Patricia, look at me." She waited until the assistant met her eyes. "Make the calls." Patricia made the calls. Marcus kept his hand on the phone of the man near Langley's office and watched the boardroom through the glass. Inside, one of the 3 figures had noticed the commotion on the floor and was saying something to the others. Langley turned, looked through the glass, and Marcus watched the exact moment that Victor Langley understood the operation had not just failed but collapsed. A contraction behind the eyes, a tightening around the jaw, the specific physiognomy of a man watching the thing he built coming apart faster than he can think. Langley was 63, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who'd spent 4 decades cultivating an appearance of authority and had largely succeeded. He was in a suit at 5 a.m., which told Marcus he'd been there all night, which meant he'd been managing the fallout since the hotel. He looked at Sophia through the glass for a long moment. Then he straightened, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the boardroom door with the bearing of someone who had decided that whatever came next, he would meet it standing up. The door opened. "Sophia," Langley said. His voice was composed, professionally composed, the composure of performance, not peace. "I'm relieved you're safe. We've been..." "Don't," Sophia said. One word. The same word Marcus had used 30 seconds ago, and with the same quality. Quiet, final, not requiring any volume to carry its full weight. Langley stopped. The 2 other figures in the boardroom had come to the doorway behind him. Marcus clocked them. One was Wallace Reeves, 70, trim, who had been on the Sterling board for 9 years, and who Marcus had assessed as the more passive co-conspirator, a man who'd been persuaded rather than recruited. The other was a woman he didn't recognize, not board, not executive staff. Legal. The kind of external legal presence you brought in when you needed someone who didn't have institutional loyalty and would execute whatever document you put in front of her without the hesitation that conscience sometimes creates. The external lawyer took one look at the configuration of the room. Sophia, Marcus, the building security supervisor who had just stepped off the elevator, Patricia making rapid calls at her desk, and made a quiet professional decision. She picked up her bag, said nothing to anyone, and walked toward the elevator. Marcus let her go. She had nothing yet. Whatever she'd been brought in to sign had not been signed. Without the document, she was a lawyer who'd attended an early morning meeting. "Reeves," Sophia said without looking away from Langley. "Sit down in Conference B and stay there." Reeves opened his mouth, closed it. He was a man who had spent decades in rooms where authority was distributed and contested and negotiated, and he understood, Marcus could see him understand it, that in this particular room, right now, the authority had already settled, and it had not settled in his direction. He went to Conference B. He sat down. Langley hadn't moved. "Victor," Sophia said, and something shifted in her voice on his name, not toward anger, away from it, into something colder and more final. "I've known you since I was 19 years old. You came to my father's retirement dinners. You spoke at his funeral." She paused. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to go sit in that conference room and wait for this to be done properly, or you can stand in this hallway and make it worse. That's the only choice you have left." The hallway was very quiet for a moment. Langley looked at Marcus. The look had something in it Marcus had received before from men who had just lost the thing they'd built. Not hatred, exactly, more like the look of someone trying to identify where they'd made the critical error, where the invisible thing had been standing. Then he looked back at Sophia, and he went to Conference B. The next 20 minutes were the kind that move in two speeds simultaneously. Too fast in the room, where things were happening in rapid sequence, and too slow in Marcus's nervous system, where each development registered with the heightened clarity of something that hadn't been decided yet. Okafor arrived first, 8 minutes after Patricia's call, still buttoning his jacket, visibly alarmed. Hendricks 4 minutes later. Morrison, who lived furthest, at 23 minutes, slightly out of breath and taking in the configuration of Conference B. Langley, at one end of the table, not speaking. Reeves beside him, looking at the table. Sophia at the other end with the printed documents from the secure printer arranged in front of her, with the expression of a man who had been told something was wrong and had arrived to find that the understatement was significant. Chen and Whitfield arrived without being called, which told Marcus that someone, probably Patricia, probably on her own initiative, in the instinctive way that genuinely loyal people act when they sense their institution is under threat, had made additional calls. He filed that away as information about Patricia that he hadn't had before, and that was worth having. Marcus stood at the back of the conference room. Not at the table. He wasn't a board member, he wasn't an executive. He was a driver who had walked in off the street with a folder of evidence and the CEO he'd spent 6 months not officially protecting. The physical fact of where he stood in the room was intentional, visible, available, but positioned as a resource rather than a participant. This was Sophia's board, her company, her moment to lead it. His job had been to get her here. She began. He had watched her in hundreds of meetings over 6 months, watched her from the front seat, from lobby chairs, from parking structures and airport arrivals. He knew her in rooms, the way she composed herself entering a space where she had authority, the way she read other people's energy before deciding how to use her own. But he had never seen her do what she did in Conference B at 5:40 a.m. with her father's company bleeding out and the people who'd tried to steal it sitting 6 feet away. She presented it without theatrics. That was the thing he hadn't anticipated. He'd expected intensity and had found instead a quality of absolute calm, the kind that isn't the absence of feeling, but is feeling so concentrated that it becomes controlled. She walked through the financial evidence first, exactly as they'd discussed. The shell companies, the transfer records, the subsidiary accounts that connected, on a chain any accountant could follow, to a holding company that served no operational purpose except to receive money routed from sterling global vendor contracts and redirected in smaller packets to personal accounts tied to Langley and Reeves through intermediary names that were real people. 2 of them former employees, one of them the son of a man Reeves had served on a board with 15 years ago. Chen and Whitfield, who had arrived uncertain, became very still at the financial records. Numbers were numbers. Numbers didn't have motives or loyalties or long, complicated histories with everyone in the room. Numbers said what they said. The calendar access logs came next, specific dates, specific times. The terminal ID that had accessed Sophia's schedule on 17 separate occasions in the 3 months leading up to the gala, cross-referenced against the building's access card logs, which placed one individual, a junior member of Langley's executive support staff, in the building outside their normal working hours on 15 of those 17 occasions. That individual had been arrested that morning at 6:10 a.m., which Marcus knew because his phone had vibrated in his jacket pocket while Sophia was presenting the financial records, and he'd read the 2-word text from his federal contact, in custody, and felt something in his chest that was close to, but not quite relief. Then the recordings. This was where Sophia paused, not from uncertainty. He could read the difference by now, but with intention. She set down the document she'd been holding and looked at the people at the table, and she said, "What you're about to hear was recorded in a private setting without the knowledge of the participants. I want to be transparent about that, because how we obtain evidence matters, and you should know how this evidence was obtained before you hear it." She looked down the table at Langley. "And then you should hear it." She played the first recording on the laptop Marcus had set on the table. A conversation between Langley and Reeves, dated 6 weeks prior, 43 seconds of audio that was not brilliant in its clarity. There was ambient noise. The recording quality was what it was, but was clear enough for the essential exchange to be unmistakable. Langley's voice. "The timing has to be the gala. There's no other window that gives us the coverage gap we need." Reeves's voice. "And if she fights the succession?" Langley. "She won't be in a position to fight anything." The room was very quiet. Reeves put his face in his hands. Langley said nothing. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who has completed his calculation and found that the numbers don't work in any direction, and who is now in the particular suspended stillness of someone who knows what comes next and is deciding how to inhabit it. Okafor, 61 years old, a man who'd been on the Sterling board for 4 years, and who Marcus had assessed as clean and was now confirmed clean by the expression on his face, said, "Victor." Just that. The name came out with a weight behind it that was neither anger nor disbelief, but something older and sadder, the weight of someone who'd known a person for years and was now adjusting every memory of that person simultaneously. Langley looked at him, said nothing. "Victor," Okafor said again, "I'm going to ask you to leave the room." It wasn't a board motion. It wasn't formal. It was one man saying a thing to another man that both of them understood had the force of everything that had just been presented behind it. Langley looked at Sophia one more time, something in his face that Marcus couldn't categorize and didn't try to solve. It was too complicated and too private, and whatever it was, it belonged to the room, not to analysis. Then Langley stood up, straightened his jacket, walked out of Conference B. Building security was in the hallway. He didn't argue. Reeves was still sitting with his face in his hands when the federal agents arrived at 6:40 a.m. They'd been downstairs since 6:15 waiting for Marcus's confirmation text. He sent it at 6:38, 2 minutes after the last piece of evidence had been presented, and 3 of the 5 clean board members had confirmed in writing that they were requesting a formal investigation and reaffirming Sophia Sterling's authority as CEO. The 2 remaining members, Chen and Whitfield, had not opposed it, which was, given everything, close enough to agreement. Marcus stepped out into the hallway while the federal agents handled the formalities inside. He leaned against the wall and let himself do something he almost never did in the middle of an operation, which was to feel the particular weight loss of a thing being finished. Not done. There would be months of legal proceedings and depositions and the slow, complicated work of repairing what had been damaged, but finished in the sense that the acute thing, the dangerous thing, the thing that had required him to sleep 3 hours a night for 6 months and check every mirror and memorize every service tunnel and spend an evening in a department store buying women's dress clothes in case of emergency, was over. He checked his watch. 7:04 a.m. Emma would be waking up right now. Mrs. Rodriguez would be navigating the breakfast negotiation. Cereal versus actual food, with the slightly weary competence she'd developed over 6 months of occasional overnight coverage. Emma would be in her pajamas, hair not brushed yet, presenting her serial argument with the formal conviction of someone who believed in the importance of their position. He pulled out his phone, sent a text to Mrs. Rodriguez. Coming to get her this morning, should be there by 8:30. Please make sure she eats real breakfast. The response came back in 40 seconds. She's already eating eggs. She said you'd want that. He looked at the text for a moment. Then he put the phone away. Behind him, the conference room door opened and Sophia came out. She leaned against the wall beside him, and they stood together in the corridor of her father's building, watching the federal agents move in and out through glass walls, and she was quiet for a long time. "It's not going to feel like I thought it would," she said finally. "No," he agreed. "It usually doesn't." She looked at him. "Does it get better?" The feeling. He thought about it honestly, about every operation he'd run that had ended and the specific feeling of the ending, the flatness of it, the way completion carried no euphoria, but just a tired, clean emptiness. "It gets replaced," he said, "by whatever's next, which is," he paused, looking for the right word, "normal. In my experience, normal is the best thing that comes after something like this." Sophia looked at the floor for a moment, then at the ceiling, then at him. "My father sent you," she said. Not for the first time, but the weight of it was different now. "He made a phone call to a lawyer who made a phone call to me," Marcus said. "I made the choice to come." "Why?" She asked it genuinely, not rhetorically. "You didn't know me. You had Emma. You had a life that didn't include any of this. Why did you say yes?" He thought about this for a moment, about the phone call, about the lawyer's voice and the careful phrasing and the single detail that had made the decision. Someone who served. Someone who knew your record. The implication of that the man making the request had done the work of finding someone specific, had looked at records and made a careful judgment about character and capability, and had decided from a hospital bed with a finite amount of time left that Marcus Kane was the right person. "Because someone trusted me with something that mattered," he said. "And I don't—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at walking away from that." Sophia looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression settled. Not resolved, not simple, but settled in the way that things settle when you finally understand something you've been looking at without seeing. "Thank you," she said. It came out plain and direct and without ceremony, the way the most genuine things usually do. Marcus nodded, looked back through the glass at the activity inside. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "There's still 3 months of depositions and about 40 hours of testimony and a legal process that—" "Marcus," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said again, and this time she said it in a way that closed the subject. He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're welcome." The sun was coming up fully now, pressing through the building's east-facing windows in long, pale rectangles across the corridor floor. Somewhere below, the city was shifting into its full morning rhythm. The elevated trains filling up, the coffee shops opening, the ordinary machinery of a city that had slept through everything and woken up to a Tuesday. The Sterling Global building was 40 stories of glass and steel with its logo lit against a brightening sky. And inside it, in a conference room on the 32nd floor, the process of putting things right was already underway. It wasn't clean. It wasn't going to be clean. Marcus had been around enough of these to know that the legal aftermath of something like this was a long, grinding, exhausting process that extracted something from everyone involved. Sophia would spend the next year fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The criminal proceedings, the board restructuring, the employee trust, the public narrative. She would make mistakes. She was already making mistakes, probably, in ways neither of them could see yet from this side of it. But the company was hers. The conspiracy had collapsed. The people who had built it were in custody or in the process of being brought there. And she was standing on her feet in a borrowed blouse with formal gown shoes from the night before, and the look on her face was not triumph. It was something more useful than triumph. It was the look of someone who had just learned something very expensive and very important about themselves and had decided to keep the lesson. Marcus pushed off the wall. "I need to go get my daughter," he said. Sophia looked at him. "Right now?" "She's 9, he said. "She has school." Something shifted in Sophia's face, surprise, and then something warmer than surprise, and then a short, quiet exhale that was the closest to laughing she'd come all night. "Go," she said. I'll call you. There are going to be things I need to walk through." "I know," he said. "Call Patricia for anything this morning. She's solid." He'd decided that in the last hour, watching Patricia make the calls and hold the room. "Better than you knew." Sophia nodded. "Better than I knew," she repeated, quietly, as if she were cataloging it alongside everything else she was recataloguing this morning. Marcus picked up the folder from where he'd set it against the wall. Reflex, you didn't leave documents, and walked to the elevator. He pushed the button and waited. Behind him, he heard Sophia go back into the conference room, heard her voice begin, calm and clear, addressing the board members still inside. The elevator came. He got in, rode down 32 floors through the building her father had built and that she had just, at substantial personal cost, kept. He walked out onto West Adams into the full morning light of a Chicago Tuesday, and he got in the gray Civic, and he drove to Wicker Park to pick up his daughter. Emma ate her eggs without negotiation that morning, which told Marcus everything he needed to know about how much she'd understood from the previous night's phone calls without being told anything directly. She was 9, not oblivious. She'd heard the careful way he'd talked to Mrs. Rodriguez. She'd registered the lateness, the brevity, the specific quality of his voice when he was managing something large and keeping it out of his words. She'd done what she always did with that kind of information, filed it, said nothing, and waited. When he walked into Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment at 8:15, Emma looked up from her plate and looked at him the way she sometimes did, the full-face assessment that she'd been doing since she was 4 years old, and that still, every time, reminded him of looking in a mirror and finding something better than he expected there. "You okay?" she said. "I'm okay," he said. She studied him for another second, then she went back to her eggs. "Mrs. Rodriguez made them wrong," she said. "The ratio was off. I'll make them tomorrow." "You better." He drove her to school. She talked about the science test for 6 minutes and then switched without transition to a detailed account of a disagreement she'd had with Jasmine about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs. A position Emma held with the evangelical conviction of someone who had researched the topic and resented having her research dismissed. Marcus listened and asked the right questions and felt, the whole drive, the specific particular gratitude of a person who has spent a night in proximity to something dangerous and is now sitting in a car talking about dolphins with his daughter, which is the best possible use of a Tuesday morning. He dropped her at the school entrance. She got out, shouldered her backpack, and then turned back and looked at him through the open door. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Whatever happened last night?" She held his eyes. 9 years old and absolutely level. "I'm glad you're here." She shut the door and ran toward the entrance and was through it before he had formulated any kind of response, which was probably the point. He sat at the curb for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he drove back into the city. The next 3 weeks were the kind of weeks that looked, from the outside, like a corporation managing a crisis, and were, from the inside, significantly more complicated than that. Marcus was not officially part of Sterling Global anymore. His driver's badge had been formally revoked the morning after the gala, automated, part of the security lockdown that Patricia had initiated when she understood the scope of what had happened, and his employment as a corporate driver had technically ended on the same night he'd walked Sophia through a maintenance tunnel to a storm drain on Randolph Street. The official story of his employment, when anyone asked, was that he'd resigned due to a personal matter and that the company wished him well. The unofficial story was considerably more interesting, and it moved through Sterling Global's 4,000 employees with the speed and distortion that important unofficial stories always achieve. By the end of the first week, Marcus had heard 3 different versions of what he'd allegedly done in that hotel corridor, each progressively more cinematic than the last, and none of them quite accurate, which was fine. Accuracy wasn't the point of unofficial stories. The point was the feeling they communicated, and the feeling they communicated, that someone had been there who shouldn't have been underestimated, was accurate enough. He spent those 3 weeks making himself available to the federal investigators in the measured, cooperative way of someone who has information that's useful and a lawyer who has made clear the parameters of that usefulness. The lawyer was the same careful voice from 18 months ago, Different phone this time, same measured cadence, same complete professionalism. He'd reappeared the morning after the gala with instructions that told Marcus the man who'd originally set this in motion had, even from beyond it, planned for the aftermath with the same thoroughness he'd apparently applied to everything else. The investigation moved faster than these things usually moved, which Marcus attributed to the quality of the evidence package and the fact that one of the four men who'd been in the hotel that night had made the decision to cooperate fully within the first 48 hours. The man from the alcove, whose name turned out to be Terrence Webb, 44, former private security, 3 previous contracts with companies that did the kind of work that didn't appear on legitimate corporate invoices, had apparently concluded, after a conversation with a federal prosecutor, that the people who had hired him were not going to extend him any particular loyalty and that he might as well extend them none in return. Webb's cooperation opened the financial architecture of the operation in ways that the document trail had suggested but not fully confirmed. Langley's lawyers filed 4 separate motions in the first 10 days. All 4 were denied. Reeves entered a cooperation agreement on day 11. Claire Park, who had not been in the hotel but whose communications had appeared in the evidence package in ways that were going to be very difficult to explain, retained counsel and said nothing publicly, which was the right legal strategy and the wrong human one, because the silence read exactly as guilty as it was. Voss resigned on day 3. He didn't fight it. He cleaned out his office with 2 boxes, which struck everyone who witnessed it as a surprisingly small amount for 12 years, and he left through the lobby instead of the back entrance, which Marcus heard about secondhand and filed away as the choice of a man who had decided to face whatever came next with whatever dignity he still had available. Marcus didn't feel particular satisfaction about Voss. He felt the flat, neutral acknowledgement of a situation resolving the way situations resolve when the evidence is what it is. Voss had made choices. Choices had weight. That was all. What Marcus had not anticipated, what none of his preparation had accounted for, because it was the kind of thing that didn't fit into operational planning, was what happened to Sophia in the days immediately after. He understood crisis in the physical sense. Threat assessment, tactical response, controlled execution under pressure. He'd been trained for it, and he was good at it, and last week had demonstrated that in ways that were going to be discussed in federal deposition rooms for months. What he had less framework for was watching someone he'd spent 6 months protecting navigate the specific aftermath that wasn't physical. The internal accounting that happened when the crisis was over and the adrenaline dropped and you were left standing in your own company, looking at the wreckage of decisions made by people you had trusted. He knew about it because Sophia called him. Not frequently. Not with neediness. Twice in the first week, then once more, then a silence of 4 days that he didn't try to fill because he understood she needed it. But the calls she made were the kind that happen between people who have been through something together and carry the shared weight of it in a way that doesn't require explanation. And in those calls, she said things that told him the internal accounting was happening and costing her more than she was letting on publicly. "I've been going back," she said, on the second call, "through every decision I made in the last 18 months, looking for the places where I should have seen it." "That's not a useful exercise," Marcus said. "I know, I'm doing it anyway." "You're going to find things that look obvious in retrospect that weren't obvious at the time." "I already have." A pause. The vendor restructuring, the charter amendment that Langley pushed through legal, the security system upgrade that Voss recommended in February that somehow only covered the corridors that didn't matter. Her voice was even. Too even, he thought. "I signed off on all of it. I was so focused on the Meridian deal and the international expansion that She stopped. "I let people do things inside the house while I was looking out the window." He thought about the right thing to say. He often thought about this with her. The gap between the useful truth and the comfortable one, and which was called for. "Your father built a company for 30 years, he said. He had people he'd known for a decade turn on it in his last year. He didn't see all of it either. He saw enough to make a phone call. But he didn't see all of it." He paused. "Nobody sees all of it. The goal is to build something that survives what you don't see." A long silence. Then, "That's either very comforting or very alarming." "Probably both," he said. She made the sound that was the ghost of a laugh. "Probably both," she agreed. The second week was when things got complicated in ways Marcus hadn't fully planned for, Though in retrospect he should have. The investigation had expanded, as well-built evidence packages tend to expand when federal investigators start pulling the threads. And what had begun as a corporate conspiracy case had started developing intersections with the securities fraud investigation that had been open for a year and a half and that had, until now, lacked the specific documentation to move forward. Langley's Delaware holding company appeared in both investigations, which meant the federal case was now substantially larger than a single company's internal crisis, and substantially larger cases required substantially more testimony. Marcus sat in a federal building on South Dearborn for 11 hours over 2 days and answered questions. His lawyer was present. The questions were thorough. He answered them completely, within the parameters his lawyer established, and he did not embellish and did not minimize and did not attempt to make himself sound like anything other than what he had been, a former Navy SEAL who had been hired by a private arrangement to protect a CEO and had spent 6 months gathering evidence of a conspiracy while doing so. When the lead investigator, a careful woman named Agent Delgado, who asked every question twice in different forms to see if the answer changed, asked him why he hadn't gone to law enforcement earlier, he said, "Because I needed it to be enough. Partial evidence creates warnings. Complete evidence creates consequences." Delgado had written something down at that. He didn't ask what. He was home by 6 each evening, made dinner, helped Emma with homework. She was doing a project on ocean ecosystems that had somehow become more elaborate than the assignment required, because Emma did not do things by half measures, which was a trait Marcus recognized and took quiet pride in. He braided her hair badly on Thursday morning, and she fixed it herself with the tolerant efficiency of someone who has accepted a limitation in another person and chosen to work around it rather than address it repeatedly. Normal. The normal that comes after, just as he told Sophia it would. It was on a Wednesday in the 3rd week that Patricia called him. Not Sophia, Patricia, which was itself a message about how the call had been decided on. "Miss Sterling would like you to come in," she said. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. She said to tell you it's not about the investigation." He came in at 10. He wore the black suit, partly from habit, and partly because the black suit was what he had for buildings like this. The lobby security guard, new, someone he didn't recognize, a sign that Sophia had already begun restructuring Voss's department from the bottom, checked his ID against a visitor list and gave him a badge and directed him to the executive elevator. Patricia met him at 32 with coffee that was actually good, which he noted as a change from the executive floor's previous coffee situation, and which suggested someone had finally addressed a problem that had apparently been tolerated for years. She led him to the conference B, not the boardroom, conference B, the room where it had happened, and told him Sophia would be 2 minutes. She was 4 minutes, which he suspected meant something had run over in whatever she'd been doing before this. And when she came in, she was in a gray blazer and had her hair down in a way he'd only seen a few times, and she looked like someone who had been running at full speed for 3 weeks and had reached the point where the speed was sustainable rather than emergency. She sat down across from him, looked at him directly. She had a folder in front of her, and she put both hands flat on it, the same gesture he'd seen her make in the safe house with the evidence documents. "I want to offer you a position," she said. He looked at her. "I heard you restructuring Voss's department. You have good candidates in there. Not that position." She opened the folder, slid a single page across the table toward him. "Executive Director of Security Strategy. It's a new role. I'm creating it." She waited while he looked at the page. "Reporting directly to me. Scope is company-wide. Not just physical security, but strategic vulnerability assessment, internal audit interface, crisis protocol. The idea is that the person in this role is looking at the things the company doesn't know to look at." She paused. "Seeing what other people aren't seeing, preparing for what other people aren't preparing for." Marcus looked at the page, the title, the scope, the salary, which was considerably different from what he'd been making as a driver. He looked up. "It's a significant role," he said. "You're a significant person," she said, simply, not as flattery, as assessment. "I've thought about this carefully, not because of what happened last month, because of what I watched you do for 6 months before that. The way you think, the way you build systems, the way you—" She stopped. "You were the only person in this company who was actually doing the job of protecting it. I want that to be your actual job." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd need conditions," he said. She looked at him. "I expected that. Not the title, not the salary. Conditions about how the role operates." He set the page down. "I don't work in a structure where my access to information is controlled by the people I might need to report on. If I identify a problem, I report it to you directly, and you have to act within a defined window, or I escalate externally. The role has to have protected whistleblower status, which means every employee who brings me something is protected, regardless of who they're bringing it about." He held her eyes. "Including me." Sophia was watching him with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered. "Including you," she repeated. "And it extends down the company. Not just executives. Anyone. The mailroom employee who notices something wrong should have the same access to this office that the CFO does." She was quiet for a moment. "That's going to make some people uncomfortable." "Yes," he said. "That's the point." She looked at him. He looked back. The conference room was very quiet, and outside its windows the Chicago skyline held its familiar position against a November sky. And somewhere in the building 4,000 people were doing their work under the impression that the worst was over. Marcus wasn't certain the worst was over. He was rarely certain of that, about anything. But he was certain that whatever came next would be better navigated with a structure that had been built to see things, rather than one that had been built to look away. "Agreed," Sophia said. "All of it." He picked up the page. "I'll need a week before I start. Emma has a school project." Sophia blinked. "The ocean ecosystems." He looked up. "I mentioned that?" "On the phone. Last week. Something that was closer to an actual smile than she usually showed. You said she was making it more complicated than the assignment required." "She is," he said. "She found a book about deep-sea bioluminescence." "Of course she did." Sophia shook her head slightly. "Take the week." He nodded, picked up his coffee, and then, because some questions mattered enough to ask even in moments when asking felt like it disrupted something, he said, "The lawyer, the one who called me 18 months ago, the arrangement your father made." He looked at her. "Did you ever find out the specifics of how he found me?" Sophia looked at the table for a moment. "The lawyer gave me a file after the investigation opened," she said. "My father had been, in his last months, he'd been doing research, into people, quietly, the way he did everything. He had a list of names, people he'd identified through military records and background sources. People he thought had the right—" She paused, finding the word. "Integrity. Specifically that. Not just skill. Integrity." She looked up. "Your name was first on the list. He'd circled it." Marcus was quiet. "He wrote a note next to it," she said. "I have the file. I read it once." She stopped, started again. "He wrote, 'This one won't leave.'" The conference room held that sentence for a moment. Marcus looked out the window. The city beyond. The morning traffic below. The small, visible rectangle of Lake Michigan if you knew where to look. Which he did. "He was right," Marcus said. "I know," she said. "I know he was." He signed the paperwork that afternoon, not the offer letter, that would come through HR in the formal way that formal things came through, but a preliminary agreement that Sophia's legal team had drafted, the one that established the protected scope of the role and the escalation structure and the whistleblower provisions. He read every line, made 2 modifications that his own lawyer suggested. Sophia accepted both modifications without argument, which he noted. He called Emma from the parking garage afterward. "How was school?" he said. "Fine. Jasmine admitted dolphins are smarter." "Good. Dad, are you getting a new job?" He paused. "How did you, You wore the good suit," she said. "You only wear the good suit for important things." He sat in the parking garage of the Sterling Global building and experienced the particular helplessness of being completely outmaneuvered by his 9-year-old daughter. "Yeah," he said. "I'm getting a new job." "Is it a good one?" "I think so." "Will you still be home for dinner?" "Most nights." "Okay," she said. Then, can we do bioluminescent jellyfish for my project? I found a source that says some of them are basically living glow sticks. Living glow sticks is not scientific language. I know, I'm going to use it anyway. He started the car. We can do jellyfish, he said. The following months were not clean. He wanted to be honest with himself about that, because he'd learned a long time ago that the stories you told yourself about your own experience shaped the experience, and the stories that omitted the difficult parts were the ones that came back to find you later. The federal prosecution was slow and grinding in the way that prosecutions always were, and Langley's lawyers were expensive and creative and found angles that had to be argued against in rooms Marcus was sometimes in and sometimes not in. And there were days when the process of justice looked more like the process of endurance than anything else. Reeves pleaded guilty in month 2. His cooperation deal required testimony that corroborated most of what Marcus had already provided. And the specificity of that testimony, the dates, the meeting locations, the specific language Langley had used, closed gaps in the timeline that the original evidence package had left ambiguous. Claire Park's silence strategy collapsed in month 3 when her communications director, a 28-year-old woman named Iris who had been hired by Park personally and had apparently not been informed of what she was enabling, provided a set of emails to investigators that made the silence strategy untenable. Park entered negotiations shortly after. Langley went to trial. That was the thing about a certain kind of man. The kind who has spent 40 years in rooms where authority was something you projected until it became real, who had built an identity so thoroughly around the image of himself that the idea of admitting to the reality was simply not available to him as an option. He went to trial, and his lawyers were excellent, and the prosecution was better. And Marcus sat in the gallery on the 4th day of testimony and watched the moment when the jury forewoman looked at the financial records projected on the courtroom screen and then looked at Langley and made the small, almost imperceptible adjustment of expression that meant she'd decided something. The verdict came 17 days later. Guilty on 9 of 11 counts. The 2 acquittals were on technical specifics of wire fraud definitions that the prosecution had included knowing they were reaches. The 9 convictions were the ones that mattered. Marcus was not in the courtroom for the verdict. He was in a conference room on the 32nd floor of Sterling Global in the middle of a security audit of the company's vendor contract approval process, which had been identified in the investigation as one of the primary channels through which the financial fraud had been routed. The audit was on its 3rd day. It was meticulous and unglamorous and involved a great deal of very close reading of very dense contractual language. And it was exactly the kind of work that nobody thought about when they thought about corporate security, and that Marcus had come to understand was actually the most important kind. Sophia knocked on the conference room door at 2:17 p.m. and came in and looked at him and said simply, 9 counts. He set down the vendor contract he was reading. Which 2? Wire fraud, technical definitions. The prosecutor said it was expected. He nodded. Sentencing? 8 weeks. She stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides and her face doing the complicated thing it did when she was feeling something she was still in the process of understanding. It's done, she said. The criminal phase, he said. The civil suits will run another year. I know. She looked at the conference room table, covered in his audit materials. How's the vendor process? Worse than I expected in some areas, better in others. I'm going to recommend a dual authorization requirement for any contract over $200,000 and an independent review cycle that doesn't run through the CFO's office. He paused. Whitfield's not going to like it. Whitfield can adapt, she said. Write up the recommendation. He looked at her. You want to read it before I implement? No, she said. I want you to implement it and tell me what you did. That was different from how things had started. He noted it. Okay, he said. She looked at the audit materials for a moment, then at him. Langley had a statement, she said, read by his attorney after the verdict. He said, she stopped, looked like she was deciding something. He said my father was naive, that he built a company without understanding that there were people who would always try to take what wasn't theirs, and that the only thing protecting Sterling Global from that fact was people like Langley who understood how the real world worked. She said it without emotion, which was a different thing from feeling no emotion. He said it like it was supposed to be an indictment of my father's character. Marcus waited. What it actually is, she said, is an explanation of why he lost. She said it quietly, without triumph. My father understood exactly what people like Langley would do. He just didn't fight them the same way they fought. He found someone he trusted and gave them the only resource he had left. She looked at Marcus directly. He was right about how the real world works. He just had a different theory about what survives in it. Marcus thought about James Sterling in his last months, doing research, reviewing records, circling names, building a final contingency from a hospital bed while the company he'd made his life was being undermined from inside. He thought about the note. This one won't leave, and the precision of it. Not this one is capable. Not this one is skilled. This one won't leave. He was a smart man, Marcus said. The smartest person I've ever known, Sophia said. Until recently. He looked at her. She held his gaze without expression, which was her way of meaning something precisely. He looked back at the vendor contracts. I need 2 more days on this audit, he said. Take 3, she said. Do it right. She left. He went back to the contracts. Outside, Chicago continued at its usual pace, indifferent and enormous and full of the ordinary machinery of millions of lives, and on the 32nd floor of a glass tower on West Adams, in a conference room that had held a conspiracy's collapse and a company's survival and the testimony of a dead man's trust, Marcus Kane read vendor contracts with the same thorough attention he brought to everything, and the work was slow and unglamorous and necessary, and he did it without complaint, because that was who he was, and had always been, and intended to remain. His phone buzzed at 4:30. Emma. A text containing only a photograph, her project display board, 3 panels covered in printed images and handwritten labels, a glowing jellyfish at the center of the middle panel with the words, Living Glow Stick. Written underneath it in Emma's handwriting, asterisked, with a footnote at the bottom reading, Author's Informal Term. Scientific name, Bioluminescent Cnidarian. He looked at the photograph for a long moment, then he saved it, put the phone down, and kept working. The civil suits ran 14 months. Marcus had told Sophia they would run a year, and they ran 14 months, which was close enough that he didn't feel the need to revisit the prediction, but far enough that he felt the weight of those extra 2 months personally, because extra months in a legal process were not abstract. They were depositions and document requests and the specific grinding exhaustion of a thing that refuses to be finished when you need it to be finished. He sat in 4 more deposition rooms. He answered questions he'd already answered in different rooms with different people asking them. His lawyer remained calm throughout, which Marcus paid him generously to be, and which he appreciated in the precise way you appreciate someone's professional competence when your own patience is wearing. Sophia handled the civil proceedings differently than Marcus would have. He would have, had he been in her position, which he wasn't, and which was important to remember, closed ranks, minimized exposure, said as little as possible through intermediaries. She did the opposite. She testified personally in 2 of the 3 civil cases rather than routing everything through legal. She sat across tables from the plaintiff's attorneys and answered questions directly and without the buffering language that corporate lawyers spend careers perfecting. It made her legal team visibly anxious. It made the cases resolve faster because there's a specific kind of opposing attorney who recalibrates when they realize the person across the table is going to be more credible to a jury than anything they can construct. And recalibration often leads to settlement conversations. And settlement conversations often lead to settlement. Marcus watched this and revised his understanding of her again. He'd been doing that since the maintenance tunnel, revising upward, in increments, the estimate he carried of who she was under the version of herself she'd been presenting to the world. The CEO, who trusted titles over character, had been a real person. She wasn't that person anymore, or not only that person, and the difference wasn't that she'd become harder. The difference was that she'd become more honest with herself about the gap between what she wanted to believe about people and what they actually showed her. That was a specific kind of growth that cost something, and she'd paid for it, and it showed in her in ways that were difficult to articulate but immediately apparent to anyone paying attention. He was paying attention. It was his job to pay attention. He told himself that regularly, in the way you tell yourself things that are true, but that have started to carry more weight than their original designation intended. The vendor audit he'd completed in the third week of his new role had recommended 11 structural changes to Sterling Global's procurement and contract approval processes. Sophia had implemented all 11, which had made Whitfield difficult for approximately 3 weeks before Whitfield came around to the position that the changes were sensible and began presenting them to outside stakeholders as evidence of the company's improved governance posture, which Marcus found irritating in the specific way of watching someone take credit for a thing they initially opposed and then deciding it wasn't worth the energy to address. He addressed it anyway, not publicly. He mentioned it to Sophia in passing during one of their Tuesday morning briefings, which had become a standing feature of the week. 30 minutes, her office, status on whatever he was currently working on, and anything she needed him to know from her end. He said, "Whitfield is presenting the procurement changes as his initiative." Sophia looked up from her notes. "I know. Does it bother you?" She considered. "It bothers me in the abstract. In practice, Whitfield is now invested in the changes succeeding because he's publicly associated with them, which means he'll defend them when other board members push back." She paused. "So I'm choosing to interpret it as strategic buy-in." Marcus looked at her. "That's a very generous interpretation." "I'm working on being generous," she said. "It doesn't come naturally." "I've noticed," he said. She threw her pen at him, not hard. It hit his shoulder and fell on the floor, and they both looked at it for a second, and then he picked it up and set it on her desk, and they went back to the briefing. But something had shifted slightly in the room, and they both knew it, and neither of them named it because some things are better left in the register of almost said. The full board restructuring took 6 months from the date of Langley's verdict. Reeves had resigned immediately. Park had resigned as part of her cooperation agreement. 2 of the remaining members had announced they would not seek renewal at the annual election, which was either principled or strategic, or both. Of the 3 who remained, Okafor, Hendricks, Morrison, Okafor had become, in the post-crisis period, the kind of board member that Sophia had previously not had. Someone who disagreed with her openly and specifically and without rancor, who pushed back on assumptions rather than strategies, who asked the question that nobody else thought to ask or thought it was safe to ask. Marcus had observed 3 board sessions now in his capacity as security director and had assessed Okafor as the most valuable person in those rooms, which was a judgment he'd made privately and had not shared because it wasn't his board and it wasn't his call. He shared it with Sophia on a Tuesday morning in March, 7 months after the verdict. "Okafor," he said. She looked up. "He's the best person on your board," Marcus said. "Not the most agreeable. The best." She set her pen down. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you sometimes look like you find him exhausting." "He is exhausting." "Yes," Marcus said. "The best people usually are." She looked at him for a long moment. The March light came through her office windows at the angle it did in the early part of the year, lower and more direct than summer, making the room feel slightly more exposed than usual. "You're talking about more than Okafor," she said. "Sometimes." She picked her pen back up. "Noted," she said, which was how she ended conversations she intended to keep thinking about. The all-company meeting was Sophia's idea. Not a press conference, not a statement through communications, an actual meeting, all hands, every Sterling Global employee who could be in the Chicago headquarters in one room and the rest on live stream, and Sophia at a podium in the atrium talking to them without notes. Marcus had advised against the no-notes part, not because she couldn't do it, but because the no-notes part was the kind of detail that looked like confidence and was actually a very specific kind of risk, and managing risk was his job. She had listened to his concern, acknowledged it, and done it without notes anyway. He stood at the back of the atrium and watched. She talked for 22 minutes. He'd sat in on enough of her speeches and presentations and boardroom sessions to know her rhythms, the points where she gathered speed, and the points where she slowed down for emphasis, the particular quality her voice took on when she was saying something she'd worked out intellectually versus something she actually believed. The 22 minutes in the atrium were almost entirely the second kind. She told them what had happened, not in the careful, legally vetted language of the press release, The press release had been drafted by a team and was accurate and was the appropriate public document. She told them what it had actually been like, in the language of someone who'd been in it. The gala, the corridor, the night in the safe house, the morning she'd walked back into the building in borrowed clothes and heels from the night before. She didn't make it cinematic. She made it honest, which was harder and more useful. She told them about the vendor restructuring and what it meant for how the company would work going forward. She told them about the new security structure and what Marcus's role actually was and what it meant for every person in the building. That there was now someone whose job it was to notice what wasn't being noticed, and that person reported to no one who might benefit from the blindness. And then she said the thing that made the atrium go very quiet. "I made mistakes," she said, "not small ones, the kind that almost cost this company everything your work built and everything my father spent 30 years building. I trusted people because of how long they'd been here and what their titles said, instead of what their actions showed. I didn't listen to warnings from someone who had no title at all, someone who had no official reason to be the most important person in this building, and he was." She paused. "I'm not telling you this because I want your forgiveness, or because I think it makes me seem humble. I'm telling you because if your CEO can make this mistake, anyone can. And the only protection against it is a company where the person with the lowest title in the room can tell the person with the highest title that something is wrong and be heard." Another pause. "We're going to build that company, starting now." The atrium was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then somebody in the back started clapping. Then more. It moved through the room in the irregular way that genuine responses move. Not the synchronized politeness of an audience doing the expected thing, but the uneven, building sound of people responding because they meant it. Marcus did not clap. He stood at the back of the atrium and watched it happen, and felt something that he didn't have a clean name for. Not pride, exactly, too presumptuous. More like the satisfaction of someone who built a thing and stood back and watched it hold weight. She found him afterward, in the corridor off the atrium, while the room was still dispersing. She walked up to him and stopped and looked at him with the direct look she used when she was going to say something she'd decided on. "Thank you," she said, "for the record." "You wrote that speech yourself," he said. "I did, but I wouldn't have known what to put in it without—" She stopped. "Without the last 8 months." He looked at her. "You would have figured it out." "Probably," she said. "Slower, with more collateral damage." She tilted her head slightly. "Are you incapable of accepting a direct statement?" "I'm capable," he said. "I just think the accurate version matters." She held his gaze for a moment, then, "The accurate version is that my father sent you, and you came and you stayed, and everything that came after came from that." She said it plainly. "That's the accurate version." He had no argument against it, so he said, "Okay." She almost smiled. "Okay," she agreed. The winter passed, the civil cases resolved. The external review of Sterling Global's governance structure concluded with a report that used the word robust 4 times in its summary section, which Marcus understood as the consultant's way of saying that the new structure was better than what it replaced without requiring them to characterize what it had replaced. The report was accurate. The new structure was better. He'd built most of it himself, in the methodical way he built everything, with backup systems for the backup systems and clear protocols for what happened when someone in authority refused to act on information they didn't want to receive. He hired 3 people for the Security Strategy Office in January. He was specific about what he was looking for and blunt in the interview process, in ways that cost him 2 candidates who decided after the second conversation that the role wasn't what they'd expected. The 3 he hired were a former Army intelligence analyst named Reyes, who was 29 and had a way of reading document trails that Marcus found genuinely impressive, a woman named Carla, who had spent 8 years doing internal fraud investigation for a financial firm and who asked better questions than most of the lawyers Marcus had sat across from in the previous year, and a 24-year-old named Daniel, who had applied for a different position at Sterling Global, been redirected to Marcus's office by Patricia, who had developed opinions about talent that Marcus had learned to trust, and who turned out to have a natural aptitude for systems-level thinking that was rare enough that Marcus reorganized the office's work structure to make room for it. He told Emma about his team at dinner one Friday. She was eating the eggs she'd made herself. She'd started making her own breakfast 2 months ago with the specific efficiency of a person who has concluded that personal control over the process produces superior results, which Marcus could not argue with. And she listened to his description of Reyes and Carla and Daniel with the focused interest she brought to things she'd decided were worth her attention. "Daniel sounds like me," she said. "He's 24. "I mean, how he thinks," she said. "Systems." Marcus looked at her. She was 10 now, had turned 10 in November, which he'd marked with a dinner at the restaurant she chose and a book about deep-sea biology that she'd finished in 9 days. She was in 5th grade and had strong opinions about everything and had recently begun the process of being difficult in the specific way that smart children become difficult when the world isn't moving at their pace, which he navigated with the patience of someone who recognized the trait. "Yes," he said, "he thinks in systems." "Is that a good thing to look for in people?" "It's one thing," Marcus said. "On its own, it's not enough. You need people who think in systems but can also tolerate the parts of the world that don't operate systematically." She considered this. "People are messy." "People are messy," he agreed. "That must be hard for you," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at her eggs with the particular focused elsewhere expression of someone who has said the thing and is waiting to see what comes back. "Yeah," he said. "Sometimes." She nodded, as if this confirmed something. "You manage it, though." "I try." "You're pretty good at it," she said, "for someone who likes systems." He looked at her for a moment. "Thanks, Em." "Don't thank me," she said. "It's an observation." She went back to her eggs. He went back to his, and the kitchen was the kitchen it had always been. The thin walls and the morning light, and the chart still on the refrigerator, slightly faded now from a year and a half of existence. The cheese-to-egg ratio documented in the formal handwriting of a 7-year-old who had since developed an interest in bioluminescent marine life and was currently in the process of shifting her attention toward climate systems, which Marcus anticipated would result in a new chart of some kind in the near future. He thought about what she'd said. "You manage it, though." The simple, slightly too accurate observation of someone who'd been watching him closely for her entire life and had reached the age where she was starting to say what she saw instead of holding it. He wasn't sure whether to be unsettled by that or grateful for it. He landed somewhere between the two, which was where he landed on most things. The Tuesday morning briefing in April was the one where Sophia told him about the Meridian expansion update, the deal that had been announced the night of the gala and that had survived the subsequent turbulence and was now moving into implementation. She walked him through the security implications of a significant international expansion: new offices, new jurisdictions, new vendor networks, new categories of vulnerability that didn't exist in a domestic operation. She talked about it with the ease of someone who had been running a large organization for long enough that the complexity was now native to her thinking, rather than something she had to construct deliberately. She was different than she'd been 18 months ago. He'd been watching the difference accumulate in small increments over time, the way you don't notice a building going up if you walk past it every day, but look back at a photograph from a year ago and are surprised by how much has changed. The fundamental structure was the same: the intensity, the directness, the refusal to soften things that didn't need softening. But the assumptions underneath were different. She'd stopped assuming that longevity meant loyalty. She'd stopped assuming that authority meant competence. She'd stopped assuming that her read of a room was necessarily right just because it was hers. She asked Marcus questions now that she wouldn't have asked 18 months ago. Not about security, which was his domain, but about people, about her own blind spots, about whether a thing she was planning to do had failure modes she hadn't seen. She asked the questions without making herself small, which was the thing he'd been most uncertain about. Some people, when they start admitting what they don't know, do it in a way that hollows them out. She did it in a way that made her more solid. He told her this. Not in those words, and not in the April briefing, which was about Meridian. He told her a version of it in May, when she was preparing for a profile interview with a financial publication, and had asked him, with the slightly impatient tone she used when she was asking for something she wasn't sure she should be asking for, what he thought her biggest professional growth had been in the past year. He'd looked at her for a moment, then said, "You used to make decisions from confidence. Now you make them from information. The decisions look the same from the outside. They're different from the inside." She'd been quiet for a moment. Is that better? It's harder, he said. Yes, it's better. She'd written something down in the margin of her interview prep notes. He didn't ask what. The thing that happened in June was not something Marcus had planned for, which was fitting, because the things that matter rarely appear in the plan. He'd been in a late meeting with Carla and Reyes about the Meridian vendor vetting process when Patricia appeared at the conference room door and told him that Emma had called the main office number, not his cell, which was the number she always used, but the company's main line, which she'd apparently gotten from the website, and had asked to speak to him, and when Patricia had asked if it was urgent, Emma had said, "Not an emergency, just important." He excused himself. He called her back from his office, and she answered on the first ring, which was unusual. "Em, what's going on?" "I got into the summer science program," she said. "The one at the university. I found out this afternoon." He sat back in his chair. The summer science program was a 6-week residential program for middle school students that Emma had applied to in February with an application that had taken her 3 weeks to write, and that she had shown him once, briefly, and then put away because she didn't like people reading things she was still working on. He had known she'd applied. He hadn't known the results were coming today. "Emma," he said, That's great." "I know," she said. There was something in her voice that was trying to be casual and wasn't quite making it. "Are you happy?" A pause. "Yes. I just wanted to tell you first." He was quiet for a moment. In his office on the 32nd floor of a building he'd walked into as a driver and now occupied in a different capacity, with the Chicago skyline through the window and the sounds of his team working in the adjacent space, he felt the particular weight of a moment that didn't announce itself as significant and was anyway. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You know that." "I know," she said. She stopped. Started again. "I wanted to hear you say it." "I'm proud of you," he said again, simply, a breath on the other end of the line. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to go call Mom." "Call Mom," he said. "And Em?" "Yeah." "Put the chart back on the refrigerator, the one you took down for the science project display." "It's been there the whole time," she said. "I never took it down." He looked out the window. "Good," he said. She hung up. He sat in his office for a minute, not doing anything in particular, just sitting. Outside, the city went about its business. The lake was visible at this hour, in this light, a flat gray expanse beyond the near buildings. He went back to the meeting. Sophia found out about the program the following Tuesday. Emma had apparently told Patricia during a visit to the office that it happened in the way these things happened. Emma sometimes came after school on days when Marcus was running late and would sit in the reception area doing homework with the focused self-sufficiency of a child who had been around professional environments often enough to be comfortable in them. And Patricia had taken a particular interest in her since the first time she'd appeared and answered a question about the company's organizational structure with a level of accuracy that had surprised everyone within earshot. Patricia had told Sophia. Sophia had come to his office door. "Science program," she said. "Yes." "When does it start?" "July 15th. She leaned in the doorway. "Are you nervous?" He looked up. "About Emma being at a residential program for 6 weeks?" "Yes." He considered being the version of himself that said no. "A little," he said. Sophia nodded. "You'll manage," she said. "You're good at managing things that don't come with a clear protocol." "That's an argument for why I'll be fine. It doesn't address whether I'll be nervous." "No," she said. "I know." She looked at him with the expression she had when she was going to say something she'd been sitting with for a while. "Can I tell you something?" "Yes." "When I walked into the hotel corridor on the night of the gala," she said, "and you came through that alcove, I want to tell you what I actually thought when I saw you." He waited. "I thought, of course," she said. "Of all the people who could have been there, I thought, of course it's him." She paused. "I didn't understand why I thought that at the time. I do now." She looked at him steadily. "You had been exactly who you were, every single day, for 6 months. I just hadn't been looking at it correctly. He held her gaze. People rarely look at what's in front of them, he said. I know, she said. I do now. A small pause. I'm working on it. I know you are, he said. She pushed off the doorframe. Tuesday, she said. Regular time. Regular time, he agreed. She left. He looked at the door she'd left open, and then out the window at the city, and then at the desk in front of him where the Meridian vetting report was waiting for his review. He pulled it toward him. He read the first page. The second. The work was careful and thorough and had gaps that he noted in the margin. Not failures, just places where the analysis needed to go one level deeper, which was always the case with the first draft of anything. He made the notes. He kept reading. The summer came. Emma packed for the science program with the same formal thoroughness she brought to the egg chart, making a list in a notebook and checking items off with a pen rather than a pencil, because she'd explained to Marcus that checklists made with pencil were psychologically easier to undo, and she didn't want to give herself the option. He drove her to the university campus on a Saturday morning in July, helped carry her bags to the dormitory, met her assigned roommate, a girl named Priya from Evanston, who had strong opinions about climate modeling and was going to be, Marcus assessed within 4 minutes, exactly the right kind of person for Emma to spend 6 weeks disagreeing productively with. Emma stood on the dormitory steps when he was leaving and looked at him with the full-face assessment she'd been doing since she was 4. I'll call you, she said. Every other day, he said. Not every day. You'll be busy, and it's good for you to be busy without checking in. She looked at him. You'll call me every day anyway. I'll call you every other day, he said. Uh-huh. She adjusted her backpack. Go back to work, Dad. He hugged her, which she accepted with the slightly too adult tolerance of a 10-year-old who was not going to admit she wanted it. Then she went inside, and he stood on the path for a moment looking at the door she'd gone through, and then he walked back to the car and drove back into the city. The 6 weeks were fine. He called every other day. She called him on the days in between about things she'd observed or learned or disagreed with, so it evened out. She sent him a photograph of a presentation she'd given about thermohaline circulation that had apparently generated a 30-minute debate in her cohort, the photograph showing Emma at a whiteboard with an expression of such complete conviction that it looked nothing like and exactly like Marcus, standing in a federal conference room presenting evidence to investigators. He showed Sophia the photograph on a Tuesday morning, which he hadn't planned to do. It came out of his pocket somehow, on his phone, while he was talking about something else. She looked at it for a long moment. She looks like you, Sophia said. People say that. Not the face, Sophia said. The way she's standing. She handed the phone back. Like she's completely certain of what she knows and completely prepared for someone to disagree. He put the phone away. She is, he said. You raised that, Sophia said. I tried to, he said. She helped. They sat in the Tuesday morning briefing for 30 minutes and covered 3 ongoing work items and 2 upcoming decisions and 1 personnel question that had been developing for a month and needed to be addressed before it got worse. They disagreed about the personnel question. They worked through the disagreement without either of them pretending it wasn't a disagreement and landed on something that incorporated elements of both positions, which was neither of their first choices and was probably better than either. After the briefing, when Sophia was walking him to the door in the way she sometimes did when the conversation hadn't quite finished, she said, You know what I think the lesson is. He looked at her. From the last year and a half? Yes. What? She looked out through her office windows at the building's interior, the floor of desks and offices visible through the glass, people doing the ordinary work of a company that had nearly not been there for them to do. The lesson isn't to trust less, she said. It's to look at what people actually do instead of what position they're in, and to make sure the structure gives you space to look. She paused. And to have someone around who's going to see what you're not seeing, not because you're bad at seeing, but because everyone has blind spots and the only way to cover them is to actually know where they are. He was quiet for a moment. That's a lot of lessons. It's been a lot of years, she said. He looked at her. The morning light on the 32nd floor in late August came at the angle that meant summer was almost done, and the days were shortening in the way they shortened in Chicago. Not gradually, but suddenly, decisively, as if the city had made a decision. In that light, Sophia Sterling looked like what she was, a person who had been through something significant and had not been made smaller by it, which was the only definition of surviving something that Marcus had ever found worth using. "Yeah," he said. "It has been." She nodded, held out her hand. Not for a handshake, more like the gesture was looking for a category and couldn't quite find one. He took it anyway, briefly, and then she let go and straightened the collar of her blazer and went back to her desk, and he walked out through the executive floor into the elevator and down 32 floors and out onto West Adams. The city was going about its business. The morning crowd on the sidewalk moved with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew where they were going and intended to get there. Marcus stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the crowd move around him, which was something he almost never did, stand still in the middle of a moving thing, and felt the specific quality of a life that had arrived somewhere real. He was not finished. There was the Meridian expansion and the vendor vetting and the 3 people in his office who were good and getting better and would need to be managed with the particular care that competent people require, which was different from the care that struggling people required, and harder in its own way. There was Emma coming home from the science program in 2 weeks, and the conversation they were going to have about Priya from Evanston and thermohaline circulation and whatever she decided she was going to do with the rest of 5th grade. There were the Tuesday morning briefings and the ongoing work of building something inside a company that could survive the things the company couldn't see coming. He was not finished. He didn't expect to be finished. Finished was for operations, not for lives, and he was done confusing the two. He turned toward the parking structure where the gray Civic sat in its usual spot. He took his phone out and looked at it, no messages, and then put it back in his pocket without sending any. He had made Emma's eggs that morning before driving her to the campus. He had used the correct ratio. She had eaten them without comment, which was her way of communicating that they were correct. And then she had pointed out that the chart on the refrigerator had a coffee ring stain on the bottom corner from some incident neither of them could specifically identify. And Marcus had said he'd replace it, and she had said not to bother. It was fine. She knew the numbers by heart anyway. He walked to his car. He got in. He checked the mirrors. All of them. Out of habit. The habit that would probably never leave and that he'd stop trying to dislodge from himself because some things are load-bearing and you leave them alone. He started the engine. He drove west into the city, through the ordinary morning, toward the work that was waiting, the way it always was, the way he had come to understand it always would be. Not because the world was safe, the world was not safe, had never been, would not become so because one conspiracy had been dismantled and one company had been protected, but because the work of making things safer, of looking carefully at what others looked away from, of staying when staying cost something, was work that needed doing and he was made for doing it. His father had thought discomfort built character. Marcus had decided a long time ago that his father was wrong about that. Discomfort alone built nothing. What built character was choosing to stay present inside the discomfort, choosing to look, choosing to be the thing that held when everything else was in motion. He had been that thing. He intended to remain it. The city moved around him, enormous and indifferent and full of people going about their lives. The lake appeared and disappeared between buildings as he drove. The radio was off. The windows were slightly cracked because the morning air at the end of August in Chicago had the particular quality that only existed for a few weeks before autumn came in and changed everything, and it was worth having the window cracked for. Marcus Kane drove west, and the city held him in it, and the morning held everything.